The Amish Single Mother. Written by Samantha Price. Narrated by Susanna Coleman. Chapter 1. Jane Byler stood by the kitchen table and read her list. 48 plain vanilla cupcakes with assorted frosting colors. 52 regular chocolate, all with chocolate frosting. 52 pink cupcakes with pink frosting. Letting out a sigh, Jane let the list slip from her fingers. It swayed through the air like an autumn leaf, landing on the wooden table. I've told her to order everything by the dozen. All her oven trays were in 12 sections. And whenever Miranda gave her an order not divisible by 12, it led to one thing: larger gas bills. Shaking her head at how Miranda never listened, she picked up a pen and jotted a note to the woman who was giving her the bulk of her work. To those who knew Jane in the English world, she was known as the Cupcake Lady. To those in the Amish community, she was little more than an outcast. She wasn't shunned, but the way people avoided her, she might as well have been. Staying in the community after having a baby out of wedlock was something that was rarely done. The bishop was on her side when she told him what had happened. He knew the real truth. But even after she told her parents, they didn't care. They wanted little to do with her and showed no interest in Tilly, who was approaching her first birthday. While Jane went through the birth and then the first few months of Tilly's life, she was supported by the charity of the community. And now she was solely supported from the sale of her cupcakes. The days were busy up until 4 p.m. when every Monday through Saturday, the day's order was collected by Miranda or one of her workers. Then Jane had time to be a regular mom, cook the evening meal, and do the daily chores. Jane had help with the cooking in the afternoons, with the cooking in the form of her 15-year-old Amish neighbor, Wendy. Jane looked out the kitchen window at the twinkling stars of the dark night sky. Tilly was in bed and the kitchen was clean, but not all the chores were done. They never were. The cupcakes took priority over chores since they were her sole income. Since her mother didn't visit and neither did anyone else, there was no one to turn their noses up at the undone tasks. In the stillness of night, while Tilly slept, Jane would sit and plan the next day's baking. Organization was the key to her busy life, and she worked better with a prioritized list. Jane's bottom was just inches off the chair she was about to sit on, and she was ready to start writing that list when a loud knock on her door startled her. Knowing the sound might wake Tilly if they knocked again, she hurried to see who it was at that late hour. Her first thought was that someone was gravely ill. Her mother or father might have even died. Then again, it could be Wendy to see if she was needed the next day. But Wendy never knocked. After she had flung open the door, her eyes adjusted to an unexpected yet not totally unpleasant sight. A tall Amish man stood before her, smiling. Since the man was a stranger, she pushed the door so it was only open a crack, and then peeped through. In the dimly lit doorway, she could tell his jaw was square and his features were strong. "Yeah?" "Jane?" he asked. She looked him up and down. His white shirt was barely tucked into his trousers and his suspenders appeared to be striped. An odd choice for an Amish man. No, he was no one she knew. She was certain of it. "Yeah, I'm Jane," she replied. "I'm Adam's grandchild." He looked at Jane as though she should know him. When she remained silent, he added, "My grandfather is Adam Fisher, from next door." He jolted his head to one side, attempting to point to Adam's house behind him with his head. "Oh, you're Adam's grandchild?" she asked. The young man smiled. "That's right. I arrived here this afternoon and I just wanted to introduce myself." "And you're Jane?" he asked. Jane wasn't happy about him being there after dark. It was inconsiderate, especially since she had a young child. He could have come there earlier or waited until the next day. She looked down at the ground. "It's late." "I know. I hope I'm not disturbing you. It's just that I wonder if you might have any coffee that I could borrow." "Just a small amount?" he asked. "Why?" He breathed out heavily and an embarrassed smile met his lips. It was then she noticed the dimples in his cheeks. "Because if you do, I'll ask if I can borrow some. I'll replace it tomorrow." When she remained silent once again, he continued. "I always start my day with a cup of coffee and I noticed that Adam doesn't have any, so I thought I'd wait right there." Jane closed the door and hurried to get the stranger some coffee. If he kept talking, he might wake Tilly, and then her peace and her routine would be out the window. On opening the cupboard, she saw instant coffee, ground coffee, and coffee beans. If Adam didn't have coffee in the house, she reasoned, he wouldn't have a coffee grinder. Reaching in, she grabbed the jar of instant and hurried back to her unwanted guest. She opened the door just enough to allow the jar of coffee and a hand through. "There." "Thank you. I'll bring it back tomorrow," he said. "No, don't." When he looked at her, shocked, she realized how abrupt she'd sounded. "It's okay, it's fine. You can keep it." She closed the door on him. "It was nice to meet you, Jane, with no last name," he said through the closed door. Rolling her eyes, she walked back to the kitchen. As soon as he heard the rumors about her, he wouldn't think it was nice to meet her. He'd be avoiding her just like the rest of them, which was partly why she'd avoided the use of her last name. Old Adam next door had been fine to her, but he didn't know what was going on around him most of the time. The next morning, Jane was on top of things and running according to schedule. Tilly and she had eaten breakfast, and now Tilly was down for her morning nap. The first batch of cupcakes was in the oven and just about cooked. She'd finished mixing the second batch when a knock sounded on the door. Jane opened it, expecting to see the man who delivered her weekly groceries running extra early. Adam's grandson stood there smiling and holding a jar of coffee. She looked down at the unopened jar. "That's not mine, that's new." "I know. I went to the store first thing and bought you a new jar," he told her. "If you were going to the store first thing, why didn't you buy a takeout coffee? And then you wouldn't have needed to borrow any last night," she asked. "Because I like to have a cup as soon as I wake up," he replied. "Keep it," she said, closing the door. Just as she was walking back into the kitchen, he knocked again. She headed back and swung the door open. "Yeah?" His head lowered, but his steely blue eyes were fixed on hers. "Are you sure your name's Jane?" he asked. She wrinkled her nose. He must have heard something about her already. "Yeah, why?" "Is there another Jane who lives here?" he asked. "No, just me." She frowned at him, slowly losing what little patience she had left. "My grandfather told me about the lovely Jane that lives next door." "Do you know where she's gone?" he asked sarcastically. He was trying to be charming. Any other woman would have fallen for it. Even though he was good-looking in an obvious way, he was too annoying for her tastes. No hint of a smile touched her lips, simply because she knew he was trying his best to make her smile. "Your grandfather and I get along," she told him. "He told me you bake him cupcakes," he replied. "I do, but to be fair, I don't bake them just for him. That's what I do for a living. I bake cupcakes, and when I have an odd number, I fill the tins with extras, and that's how I have some left over sometimes." "He likes them," he replied. She shook her head. She was wasting time talking to him when she could be making cakes. That was probably more than she'd spoken to anyone for the whole week. He tipped his head back and sniffed the air. "Is that something burning?" She raced into the kitchen to see smoke rising from the cracks of the oven door. With no time to pull on her oven mitts, she held them over her hands, opened the oven, and pulled out the tray. She turned around to see if there was a clear space to dump the tray somewhere, and she got such a fright to see that the man had followed her inside, she lost her grip on the tray. As it fell, she tried to steady it and burned her hand. She let out a yowl. Chapter 2. He rushed to her. "Your hand." "Please leave the house." She grabbed a tea towel and bent down to pick up the pan before it made a mark on her linoleum flooring. "They're ruined," she muttered, fighting back tears. Every cent she made was for Tilly's and her future. She couldn't afford mistakes like this. "Are you okay?" he asked. "No, I'm not," she spat out. "I've burned my hand too." He whipped around to the tap and turned it on. "Quick, put it under here," he told her. "It'll be okay. I burn myself all the time. It's a hazard of the job." She dumped the tray on the large sheet of metal that covered most of the table. Why hasn't he gone yet? She didn't want to be too rude to the man since Adam had always been good to her. "Under here." He spoke with such force it startled her, and she looked up at him in shock. He gave a small smile. It'll make it better. Trust me. She turned, switched off the oven, and then stuck her hand under the cool running water. Turning her hand over, she saw the angry red mark that stung so badly. He stepped back a bit while she glanced over at the black cupcakes. This isn't a good sign, she said. What's that? He asked. When the day starts out like this, it just gets worse. I've lost time, and I hope the rest of the cakes won't smell of smoke. There would be nothing worse. Yeah, smoked fish is tasty, but I don't think I'd fancy smoked cake. How many do you make a day? He asked. It varies, but mostly 144. I supply a caterer, and she also owns a restaurant. And is that all you do? He asked. She looked at him open-mouthed, wondering if she'd heard correctly. And where would I find time to do anything else? That's a lot of cupcakes. It takes me all day. It's not just the baking, it's the packaging and the frosting and also the decorating. He glanced at her oven. If you had a bigger oven, it wouldn't take you as long. Surely it would be more cost-effective too, he said. I know that, she snapped before she caught herself. You're right. That's what I'm saving for. She twisted her body to stare at him. What did you say you're visiting Adam for? She asked. The rest of the family is worried about him, he replied. Are they worried because he's leased this house to me? Do they want me to pay more? Is that why you're here? I guess I can manage more, but he could have asked me himself. They didn't need to send you, she told him. He laughed. Relax. It's not about you. It's his house. He can do what he wants with it. No, they're worried about him. He never writes or calls anymore, so they sent me to stay for a while, he replied. They sent you? She turned the tap off. Leave it on for longer, he said as he moved forward and turned the tap back on. Yeah, they sent me. Once she had her hand back under the water, he looked around about him. Do you live here by yourself? He asked. I've got Tilly, my daughter, she replied. He glanced over at the dining room off from the kitchen, which Jane had fixed with a gate to make a large playpen. How old is she? He asked. She's nearly 1. Did your husband die? You ask a lot of questions. We've only just met. As annoying as he was someone to talk to, and she hadn't had many of those of late. He laughed. I'm sorry, do you have ice? What for? Your hand, he replied. She turned off the cold water. It should be okay now. You should look after it, he told her. I don't have time. I've got cupcakes to bake, and it's easier for me if I do as much as I can before Tilly wakes, so I'm sorry to sound rude, but you'll have to leave. I'm sorry about your cupcakes, he said. Me too. On his way out, he looked over his shoulder at her as she followed right behind him. Shouldn't you use a timer? He asked. She was tempted to say something rude or throw something at him, but she managed to calm herself. Normally, I don't need one because people aren't knocking on my door so early in the morning. He chuckled. I don't see why not. If you stay here any length of time, you'll find out why, she replied. Once he was at the front door, he turned to face her. Why? Is there something wrong with you? She opened the door wide and gestured with her hand for him to leave. There's nothing wrong with me. What will I find out if I stay here long enough? He asked. I don't know. I've got no idea what they say about me behind my back. That wasn't quite true. She had a pretty good idea. Have you got something in those cupcakes that makes you paranoid? He asked. She fixed her hands on her hips. There's nothing in my cupcakes. They're perfectly good. Calm down. I didn't mean you had anything in your pancakes, he told her. They're cupcakes. I meant cupcakes. I don't know why I said pancakes. I must be hungry, he said as he laughed. Well, go and cook yourself some pancakes, Adam's nameless grandchild, she said. Maybe I will. Jane with no last name, he said with a wink. Fine, you do that. She closed the door on him, hoping he hadn't been hinting for her to make him breakfast. Jane headed back to the kitchen, figuring that the best way to get rid of the smoke was to leave the oven door open and open the windows. Once she threw out the charcoal black cakes, she gave the warm oven a wipe down with a damp cloth. Feeling her angry wound stinging, she turned to the sink and let the cold water wash over it once more. This was a setback, but she was used to those. When there was another knock on the door, she headed back out, hoping it wasn't Adam's grandson again. It wasn't. The delivery man, Joe, was there with her weekly food order. Jane had sourced the best ingredients at the lowest prices at a bulk wholesale rate, and the firm had agreed to free delivery. The eggs came fresh from the chickens next door, gathered by Wendy and kindly left at her door in the early hours of the morning. When Joe had gone, she glanced over at Adam's house and wondered how long his handsome grandson was staying. If the family was so worried about Adam, why hadn't they taken him to live with them? The rest of the day she spent angry with Adam's grandson for being the cause of her ruined batch of cakes and her burned hand. Walking right into her house the way he'd done was just unforgivable. Chapter 3. Jane always baked the cakes as early in the day as she could, so they'd be cooled and ready for the decorating phase that took place later in the day. Jane peeped into Tilly's room. Her daughter normally never cried when she woke. "Hello, my baby, you're awake already. I'll change your diaper and give you something to eat." She leaned down and picked her up. "Moma." As Tilly normally did, she reached for the strings of Jane's prayer cap, pulling them into her mouth before Jane could move them away. "No, Tilly, I told you not to do that." When Tilly had undergone a diaper change, Jane placed her in the high chair and they both had lunch. It was early for most people to have the midday meal, but with their early start, it made sense for them to eat just before 11. Everything had to be run according to a routine for Jane to produce the cakes on time. When they'd finished eating, Tilly was placed into her large playpen area and Jane went back to work. Movement outside the window caught her eye and she looked out to see Adam's grandson walking from his grandfather's house to hers with something in his hands. Jane sighed loudly. What now? There was no time designated to answer the door to unwanted guests. Just as well she didn't have anything in the oven this time. She opened the door just as he was walking up the porch steps. "Hello," he said as dimples appeared in his cheeks when he smiled. "Look, I don't want to be rude or unfriendly, but I'm very busy all through the day. I explained to you earlier that I work here at the house." She replied. "I know you're working," he told her. "I've heard people don't respect your time when you work from home. They think they can stop by at any time, but they wouldn't do it if I worked in an office. Would you?" she said angrily. He frowned and his smile was gone. "Would I what?" he asked. "Would you stop by like this if I was working in an office?" "No, because my grandfather doesn't live next to an office building." He flashed her a beaming smile. His cute act was good, but he was wasting his time on her. She folded her arms across her chest. "Do you want something?" "No, I came to give you this." He held out a white box. Since he held it out, she took it from him, and once it was in her hands, she noticed it was light. "What is it?" "It's a cake." She didn't believe she'd heard correctly. "Excuse me?" "A cake," he repeated. "You brought me a cake?" she asked. He nodded, grinning widely. "I look at cake all day. Why would you give me a cake?" "As a peace offering, we got off to a bad start," he said. She shook her head, staring at the box. I couldn't think of what else to bring." His smile was gone, and he looked down. "Anything but cake," she said. "It's red velvet," he said as he smiled. "Look, that's really nice of you, and I can tell you're a nice young man, but—" His sudden laughter startled her. "Nice young man? No need to be condescending. I'm older than you. I just wanted to do something nice. You seem to be going through a tough time," he said. "I don't need anyone to be nice to me." "I said do something nice for you. Shouldn't you expect everyone to be nice to you?" he asked. "Look, you're new here and you don't know how things work." Time was ticking away, and talking to Adam's grandson wasn't making her money. She had to get rid of him and get back to work. Now Tilly wailed because she was used to seeing her mother in the kitchen when she was in her play area. "I'm coming, Tilly," she called over her shoulder. "Is that your daughter?" he asked. "No, it's a puppy I've trained to sound like a young child." Now she felt bad for being so rude. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say that. I do have to go and get on with the baking." She offered him back the cake by way of extending it toward him. "You don't want the cake?" he asked. When she held it out further, he had no choice but to take it from her. "It's a lovely thought, and I appreciate it. Your grandfather will eat it," she told him. "I'm sorry to bother you, Jane." He took a step back and said under his breath, "Jane with no last name." "I have to go. She closed the door and headed back to the kitchen. "It's okay, Tilly. Mom's back. We had a visitor, but he's gone. He was a really annoying one, but he eventually left. He brought us cake. Can you believe that? Wendy will be here later to help us." "Moma," Tilly mumbled as she played with the toy cupboard once full of plastic bowls and spoons that were now scattered on the floor around her. After Jane measured out the flour into the sifter, she moved forward to look out the window at Adam's grandson. She still didn't know his name. He said he was older, but how would he know how old she was? Perhaps he was in his mid-20s, so it was reasonable for him to think he was older. Jane felt a lot older than her 20 years after everything she'd been through with the unexpected pregnancy. The outrage from a segment of the community who didn't know the truth, and her family all but disowning her. The bishop had announced at one of their meetings that Jane was not shunned due to certain circumstances. She'd asked him not to tell everyone she'd been raped, not wanting Tilly to know she'd been born from violence. Many people had guessed what had happened, although no one except the few people Jane had told knew for sure. Fixing her eyes on the man's back, she noticed an air of confidence about him. It was odd to have someone be so friendly with her, but she didn't need his attention. Chapter 4. At 2 o'clock, Wendy rushed into the kitchen. She never knocked. "Did you see him?" she asked. Jane looked up. "Who?" "Japheth. He's staying with Adam next door. Someone said he's Adam's grandchild." "Ah, that's his name. Yeah, I saw him. He came here and made me burn my cakes in my hand early this morning." Jane held up her hand to show her young friend. "Ouch." "It still hurts. It could have been worse, I suppose." "Is he really as handsome as they say?" Wendy asked. Jane narrowed her eyes. Who was talking about him? "Everyone. Well, all the girls. They say he's got big brown eyes and dark hair, he's tanned, and he's got the broadest shoulders," Wendy said. Jane shrugged. "His eyes are blue." Wendy whipped her head around to stare into Jane's face. "Ah, blue are they, yeah?" "Yeah," Jane replied. "So, you noticed his eyes?" Wendy asked. "I'm not interested in him, if that's why you're smirking like that. I just notice people's eye color, that's all," Jane said. Anyway, what do you think of him?" Wendy asked. He was, she thought, the type of man girls would like. It was a wonder he wasn't taken already. "He's all right. He's friendly." "Is that all?" "I guess he's handsome," Jane admitted. "I can't wait to meet him." Wendy clapped her hands excitedly. Jane concentrated on piping the frosting onto the cake in front of her while her friend stood staring. It was an art she'd perfected to get it just so. Wendy was a whiz at decorating the cakes, arranging the sprinkles and extras, and that allowed Jane to get on with more of the piping. Wendy didn't have the knack to pipe the frosting just yet and needed more practice. When Tilly gave a few whimpers, Jane looked at the clock. "Do you mind giving her a bottle and putting her down for her nap?" "Sure, I'd be happy to," Wendy replied. Several minutes later, Wendy reappeared in the kitchen. "She's nearly asleep." "Thank you, Wendy. She'll be asleep soon. It never takes her long." "Well, what do you think about Japheth? You've hardly told me anything about him," Wendy asked. "He seems nice. There's not really much to tell apart from him being the cause of my burn," Jane replied. "I've been praying that you'll meet a man so Tilly can have a family with a mom and a dad," Wendy said. Jane chuckled. "Really? That's kind." Wendy was full of youthful naivety, and Jane hoped that would never have to change. "Tilly and I are our own family. All I'm doing is making a decent life for Tilly and me. If the perfect man came along, I wouldn't turn him away, but looking for a man isn't in my plans." Wendy gasped. "Why not?" "It's easier that way, that's all. You know what my life's like. A man would hardly fit in. And if I ever got married, how do I know that he and his family would treat Tilly well?" "Why wouldn't they?" Wendy asked. "I don't want to talk about it anymore. You can talk about Japheth or anyone else you want, but don't talk about me with a man, okay?" Wendy nodded. "I won't. What would you like me to do now?" Jane glanced at the clock once more. Miranda would be there in an hour. "We've got 1 hour to get these finished and boxed before Miranda gets here. You decorate them as I frost them." Jane had set 4 extra cakes onto the oven trays to take over to Adam and his grandson when she was done with the day's work. She hadn't meant to be so hostile to Japheth when he was only being friendly. She regretted her rudeness. Since some of the day's order was for mini cupcakes, she had spare room on the trays. While they were helping Miranda to the car with the boxes of cakes, Miranda asked, "I've got a full day tomorrow, Jane, so would you mind just this once dropping the order at the restaurant?" "That's not part of the deal," Jane said. "Just this once? I've got 2 workers on vacation, and the rest of the staff will be needed at the restaurant tonight full-time. I'm sorry, but I can't spare one of them to drive out here. I thought you wouldn't mind. I'll pay the taxi fare, of course. Please," Miranda pleaded. Miranda had never asked her before. "Okay then," Jane agreed. Besides keeping Miranda happy, it would be a good reason for her and Tilly to get out of the house. She hadn't been anywhere in so long. Miranda patted her on the shoulder. "Thanks so much, Jane. I appreciate it." Miranda got into her car and sped down the driveway. "Where do you have to take the cupcakes?" Wendy asked, having been too far away to fully hear what was said. "To her restaurant," Jane told her. "That explains it. She owns a restaurant and she does catering?" Wendy asked. "Yeah, I thought you knew that. I worked in her restaurant when I was on Rumspringa," Jane replied. "Yeah, I knew that, but I didn't know the other thing. No wonder she always seems in a hurry." Jane sighed as they walked back up the porch steps. "I'd like to own a little business, a store somewhere one day." "You will, and I'll be one of your workers," Wendy said. "Absolutely, I'd hire you in a heartbeat." Wendy giggled. "Tomorrow's Saturday. Do you want me here early so we can start and finish early?" "Thank you, and I must pay you more if you're spending all Saturday here when you could be with your friends," Jane said. "I don't want any more than normal. Just give me a job when you open your restaurant. Anyway, I'm spending Saturday afternoon and Saturday night with my friends." "Are you sure your parents don't mind you being here so often?" Jane asked. "They don't mind. They like you, and they hardly notice I'm gone," Wendy assured her. Chapter 5. Jane placed Tilly in her high chair, lined up all the vegetables on the table, and then sat down next to Tilly to peel them. Tilly bounced up and down, trying to get one of the carrots. "Hold on, I'll cut you one." She handed her daughter a strip of carrot, and chewing on that kept her occupied. As Jane peeled the vegetables, she thought back over her day and how she'd treated Japheth. Her newly developed bad temper was something she didn't like, and she always felt dreadful after every outburst. She'd even been a bit short with Miranda. She looked over at Tilly, who was happily working her new bottom tooth into the carrot. "Let's take those cupcakes over to them soon, after I cook our vegetables and fry our meat." Tilly smiled at her as though she'd understood every word. It was just getting dark when she and Tilly were ready to take over the cupcakes to Japheth and Adam. Tilly had been bathed and was ready for bed. "I'll take you over to visit Adam and his grandson, and then it's into bed for you, okay?" Her baby stared up at her, babbling a Tilly talk reply. With Tilly on her hip and a plate of cupcakes in the other hand, she made her way to Adam's house. When she got to the front door, she found she didn't have a spare hand to knock. "Hello," she called out. A few seconds later, Japheth opened the door. "This is a surprise," he said. "This is my peace offering," she said, handing him the plate of cakes. It was then she remembered that he already had a red velvet cake, so it seemed a little weird to be bringing him more cake. He was too polite to point that out. His face lit up as he stared at them. "Wow, these are your famous cupcakes?" he asked. "They are," she replied. He placed his hand on his chest. "For me?" "Well, for you and for Adam," she said. "Come in." "Oh no, I've got to put Tilly to bed. I didn't mean to bother you or anything," she said. He stepped back. "You're here now, so come inside." "Hello, Tilly," he said as Jane stepped inside. "She can't talk yet. She says some form of language and it's all mumbles. Maybe she knows what she means." Jane giggled. When she walked further inside, she saw Adam asleep on the couch. He was in a seated position with his head back and his mouth wide open. No, I'm sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't have been talking so loudly. Why didn't you tell me Adam's asleep?" "Don't worry, he's a sound sleeper. Come through to the kitchen," he said. She followed Japheth into the kitchen where she smelled the dinner cooking. Are you having a roast? Correct. Would you like to stay? He asked. No, thank you. We've already eaten. Did you cook or did Adam? Adam's been asleep for the past hour. I cooked. I quite enjoy cooking, he replied. I didn't realize, she said. He glared at her so hard his brow furrowed. I don't look like the type of man who could cook, or you didn't realize that a man could cook, he asked. Jane couldn't keep the smile from her face at the way he pretended to be offended. I guess so. Maybe both, or all three, I mean. Most of them can't. It's not that difficult. You're right, it's not. But too difficult for a man? He asked. Jane laughed, realizing he was acting like the male version of her. He placed the plate of cupcakes on the table and looked at her. What's so funny? Nothing. She coughed and made a serious face. I should have brought you cupcakes another night when you didn't have the red velvet cake to eat as well, she said. You can't have too much cake in the house, that's what I always say. Have a seat, he said. He quickly turned, leaned over, and checked on the food in the oven. She sat down at the kitchen table and placed Tilly on her lap. When he closed the oven, he sat down opposite her. How's your hand? Lifting her arm above the table, she showed him. It still hurts, but I'll live. He grimaced. It looks sore. Jane nodded. Yeah. Anyway, what did you do today? Not much. Just talked with Adam and did a few repairs around the place. I know what you were doing, he said. Yeah, I'm always busy, except on Sundays. It was nice of you to make us the cupcakes. I'm looking forward to tasting one. I won't have one now, or I'll spoil my dinner, he said as he drummed thoughtfully on the table with his fingertips. I wonder where that rule came from. What rule? She asked. The rule where you can't have sweet things before you eat the main meal, he told her. That's a good point. I think sweet things fill you up and then you don't want to eat your vegetables, she said. Yeah, you're probably right. Spoken like a mother, he replied. I am one. You've all got the same mother rules, he said. When he smiled, she saw how truly handsome he was. He had the perfect-shaped masculine face and his nose wasn't too big or too small. She pushed out her chair. I should be going. So soon? Can't you stay and talk to me for a bit? He asked. Okay, just for a few more minutes. She sat down again. Tell me about your family. He fixed his eyes on her. There's not much to tell. I'm the youngest of 7. The eldest 2 are girls and the rest are boys until me. They're all married and have children. What about you? We have something in common. I'm the youngest as well, the youngest of 5. All boys. Mom always wanted a girl, but she didn't get one. All your brothers are married? She asked. Yeah, the closest one to me in age just got married last month. She nodded, trying to look interested. But she wasn't, not really. Small talk was something she'd never been good at. She was pleased when Tilly started crying. I really should go. Tilly's getting tired. He stood as well. Is she ready for bed? He asked. Yeah, this is bedtime for her. He walked her to the front door, and on the way she glanced over to see Adam still asleep. Thank you for stopping by, Jane, and for bringing cake. You and cake are always welcome, he told her. Just as she walked out the door, she turned around. Enjoy the cupcakes. I'm sure I will, he replied. She took 2 steps away. Oh, Jane, he exclaimed. She spun back around. Yeah? You and Tilly should come for dinner one night, he said. Yeah, maybe. I'll cook something special. I'll look up Adam's recipe index cards. He giggled. Jane giggled. Knowing Adam didn't have recipe cards, Japheth was being silly. Okay, one night, maybe. She walked faster when Tilly made whimpering sounds. Chapter 6. The next day, Jane was half expecting Japheth to stop by, but there had been no sign of him. She and Wendy were ahead of schedule with the cakes. Wendy had offered to watch Tilly while Jane delivered the cupcakes to Miranda's restaurant. But Jane wanted to take her daughter into town with her. They would have something to eat at a cafe and enjoy getting out of the house for a change. 2 of Miranda's staff members helped get the cakes out of the taxi while Jane headed inside to collect the money from Miranda. Miranda's in the back if you want to see her, one of the staff said as she passed by. Thanks. Jane pushed Tilly in her stroller, heading to Miranda's back room. Miranda was busy talking with someone when she pushed the door open. Oh, I'm sorry, Jane said, taking a step back and closing the door. Miranda met her outside the office. What do I owe you today, Jane? Jane handed her the invoice and the stub from the taxi driver. Miranda took it from her, walked back into her office, and then reappeared with the money. Thanks, Jane. I really appreciate you bringing this in. I won't ask again. We've just got so much going on here tonight. You don't want your old job back, do you? What? And leave you with no cupcakes? No, Jane said. Miranda laughed. Bye, Jane. After she had said goodbye to Miranda, she pushed the stroller through the restaurant and back onto the busy street. Tilly was quiet because she loved going for walks in the stroller. Jane headed further up the street, stopping every now and again to look in store windows. When someone tapped on her shoulder, she turned around and looked into the eyes of the person she feared most in the world. It was the man who'd assaulted her. She'd heard he'd moved to New York, otherwise she never would have gone into town. Leave me alone. She backed away, stepped aside, and pushed the stroller away from him. Wait up, Jane. Go away. She heard footsteps, and then he leaped in front of the stroller and she couldn't move. Wait up. You went back to the Amish? He asked. Obviously, she replied. His gaze dropped to Tilly and then he eyed Jane suspiciously. How old is he? He asked. None of your business, and he's a she. He looked back down at Tilly. Is that my kid? He asked. Don't be ridiculous. Now get out of my way or I'll scream. He didn't move a muscle. Instead, he crouched down to Tilly's eye level and looked into her face. She looks just like my brother's kid, he said. All kids look the same. Move out of my way. Jane looked around, hoping against hope that there would be a police officer nearby. But the street had become strangely deserted. When he moved out of her way, she started walking off, but he grabbed her arm and dug his fingers in so hard she yelped in pain. I reckon that's my kid, he said angrily. She's not, Jane snapped. I told you already. Whose is it then? He asked. She stared into his hateful eyes. None of your business. He chuckled. That's what I thought. She didn't want to speak to him, but she had to know whether she could come back into town again. Didn't you move away? I just got back yesterday. I kind of like the idea of being a father now my brother's got a kid. Can't let him get one up on me with my folks. This news'll make my parents happy, and I reckon this kid'll help me get back into their will. He laughed. A shiver ran down her spine. His parents were influential and wealthy. That was one reason she had never reported the rape. He told her that no one would believe her, and that his parents had more than enough money to hire the best lawyers. Then you'll look a complete fool when they find out she's not yours. Somehow I don't think that'll happen, he said coldly. As soon as he released her arm, she pushed the stroller as fast as she could away from him. If you don't want to share, I'll be happy to take her from you, he called out. She made no comment and didn't look back. Even if he tried to take her away, Jane was sure it wouldn't happen. Not when she'd raised Tilly these first 12 months of her life. It was only 6 blocks later when she slowed down and saw a cafe. A quick look behind her told her she hadn't been followed. After wrestling the stroller through the doors of the coffee shop, she sat down at one of the tables, got Tilly out of her stroller and held her tight in her arms. No one's taking you away from me. Use? Jane laughed at Tilly trying to say juice. You can have some juice. You can have whatever you want. When she saw a figure in front of her, she said, I'll have an apple juice and I'll have a... She looked up to see it wasn't a waiter at all. Chapter 7. She was relieved that it was Japheth from next door who was standing there, looking down at her. Oh, it's you. Mind if I sit? He asked. She nodded, secretly glad to see someone friendly after running into Scott Crittenden. Please do. Did I hear you say you wanted an apple juice? He asked. She managed to smile. For Tilly, she loves apple juice. I'll get it. What would you like? He asked. No, that's okay. I'll get it. What would you like? He shook his head. Allow me. As an apology for being silly enough to buy you that red velvet cake, he said. Thank you. Just a hot tea for me, please. Anything to eat? he asked. She shook her head. I won't be a minute, he told her. Jane put Tilly back in her stroller. Japheth sat back down a few minutes later and placed a number on the table. Now, what's got you looking so upset? You didn't burn more cakes, did you? What are you doing here? Jane asked, avoiding his question with one of her own. I was having a look around the town, and then I saw you talking to someone and then you ran away from him. Did he upset you? He asked. She narrowed her eyes. You followed me here? You looked upset, he told her. Jane hadn't seen anyone when she looked around. I didn't see you when I was talking to him. Where were you? I was at the post office across the road, he said. Shaking her head, she said, He's a dreadful person. I kind of figured that, the way you were trying to get away, he said. What did he do to make you so upset? She shook her head. It doesn't matter now. It's all in the past. Anyway, are you going to the young people's thing on tonight? Wendy was telling me that there was something on. He shook his head. I'm a little old to be included in the young people's things. Exactly how old are you? She asked. 28 and 5 months and 7 days. Exactly, he said. She laughed and said, Oh, I didn't think you would be that old. I thought you were 22 or 23 or something. And I'm guessing you're around 20, although you act like you're 40, he said with a chuckle. Jane lowered her gaze to the red and white checkered tablecloth. Then she looked back into his deep blue eyes. That's how I feel sometimes. I'm a mother now, and trying to make ends meet. You say that as though your life's over, he said. I didn't mean it to sound like that. I love being a mother. He scratched his neck. If you don't mind me asking, Adam told me you're not that close with your family. Adam said they're in the community and don't live far away and they don't help you out, he said. My family and I don't see eye to eye about many things. It's just me and Tilly now. You and Tilly against the world? He asked. Not really. I've got some good friends in the community. Wendy's family and the bishop and his family have always been good to me. They saw to it I had enough money to get by before I started cooking for Miranda. He continued to stare at her, which made her uneasy, so she kept talking. Anyway, how's Adam? Have you achieved what you've come here to do? Wait a minute, he said. Was that guy back there threatening you about something? He asked. He was. He shook his head. I didn't realize. What would you have done if you had? I would have told him to leave you alone, he said. Jane shook her head. He's a dangerous person. I'm sorry, Jane. I'm pretty thick in the head sometimes, he told her. Jane gave a little giggle and then was distracted by Tilly trying to undo the strap that kept her safely in her stroller. Stay there, Tilly. There's a high chair over there. Want me to grab it? He asked. She glanced around to where he was looking. Yeah, please. He leaped up, and while he was gone, Jane unstrapped Tilly and held her in her arms. When he brought the chair over to the table, she lowered Tilly into it. The chair didn't have any straps, and Tilly was a squirmer, so Jane pulled the chair closer to her. Anyway, you asked me if I've achieved what I set out to do here yet, he said. Have you? Jane asked. You want me to go already? I thought you'd want me to stay a bit longer seeing as we've become friends, he said. Friends? Is that what we are? We're sitting down together. We must be. We're both too old to go to young people's things. You're old in the head anyway, and we don't fit into the young married scene because we're not married. It makes sense we'd become friends. We've got so much in common, he said. Jane smiled at him and found she was enjoying his company. He was unlike any man from her community. I'm even more odd because I have a child. At least it's respectable to be single and childless. I don't fit. Jane, you are respectable, and you shouldn't think otherwise, he told her. I know I am. It was others who didn't think she was. I didn't quite mean it like that. Good. The waitress brought apple juice, coffee, and tea to the table. Thank you, Japheth said. Your toasted sandwiches won't be long. How many are you having? Jane asked when the waitress left. I'm having one and you're having one. I'll share with Tilly too if she wants some, he said. We're not hungry. We ate before we left home, she said. Well, all the more for me then. He shook his head. You make it hard. What? She asked. You make it hard to be friends with you, he told her. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be so horrible. It's just that I'm out of practice being around people. I go to the meetings, but I keep to myself most of the time. Not many people talk to me, and I've given up trying to talk to them. I have to warn you, I'm an outcast. You might be too if you're seen with me. Yeah, you keep telling me that. You don't fit what people think you should be. I'm an outcast too, he said. Jane laughed. He was handsome, and all the girls were talking about him according to Wendy. He was anything but an outcast. Why would you say that? He looked up. I'm misunderstood. When his lips twisted into a smile and she saw his dimples, she knew he was poking fun at her. She leaned toward him. Haven't you heard talk about me yet? He leaned further forward until his face was 2 inches away from hers. No. Jane drew back. Really? Perhaps you're not as interesting to others as you think, he said. It's not that. Drink your hot tea before it goes cold, he told her. Jane looked at her tea, frowning as he picked up his coffee. It had been a while since someone had told her what to do. She took a quick sip and then poured juice into Tilly's empty bottle. Tilly grew excited watching her juice be poured and banged on the tray of her high chair, causing Japheth to jump. Laughing at him, Jane passed the bottle to Tilly. Are you scared of babies? Sometimes, I guess. I haven't had much to do with them. 2 of my brothers have children, but I can't get near them. They're younger than Tilly, and my sister-in-laws don't let anyone near them. Why's that? He shook his head. Overprotective, I guess. I was like that for the first few months. I think I got over that when she started crawling and putting everything she could into her mouth. The waitress put 2 plates of toasted sandwiches on their table. Are you waiting on anything else? No, thank you. The waitress took their order number off the table. Maybe I could have a little bit, Jane said, suddenly feeling hungry. Sure. He pushed 1 plate toward her. Cheese and tomato. What could be better on a day like today? Jane ignored his prattle and noticed Tilly's gaze was fixed on the food. She broke off a crust and handed it to her. Tilly eagerly took it from her and started chewing on it. She looks hungry now, he said. Jane said, or just interested to try something new. What are you doing in town? You told me you never get out and never go anywhere, he asked. I don't usually. The lady I cook for needed me to drop the cupcakes off today. I could have driven you. I've got the use of Adam's buggy, he said. I couldn't have asked and it didn't occur to me, she replied. While I'm here, you should take advantage of having an extra friend since you don't have many of them, he said. She couldn't help but smile. I'll remember that. I'm actually pretty bored. Adam sleeps after breakfast and again early afternoon, and I'm not working at all. So there's nothing for me to do, he said. Jane giggled. It sounds like he sleeps as much as Tilly. Yeah, and he's not nearly as cute. Seriously, though, do you have anything you need done around the place? Mowing my lawn was more than enough help. I didn't... Oh, that's your way of asking me to mow your lawn. She smiled, trying not to laugh. I'll do it. I'll mow your lawn soon. Don't worry about that, he said. Thank you. That would be wonderful. I always run out of time to do things outside the house. I could plant a garden for you too, he said. That's nice of you, but I'd have to look after it, and I wouldn't. And then all the plants would die a horrible death of thirst, or die from strangulation from weeds. She shook her head. It would be dreadfully slow and awful for them. You don't have time to water plants or weed a garden? She shook her head. My life's pretty hectic. It's not easy working from home with a baby. It's 2 jobs in one. If I had one more thing to do, my stress level would be up to here. She butted the palm of her hand against the top of her forehead. He drew his eyebrows together. What about for when Tilly's older? Wouldn't she like a garden to play in? We could plant one together when she's old enough, she told him. Fair enough. I'm pretty good at figures and costings. I helped the family farm save money, and I'd reckon if you show me the figures for your business, I'd be able to help you make a bigger profit, he said. It annoyed Jane that he assumed she wasn't already running things well. Was that because she was a woman? Thank you, but I've already been over and over the figures. A fresh set of eyes could help. He took a large bite of his toasted sandwich. No, thank you. Thinking she sounded a little abrupt when he was only trying to be helpful, she added, I buy the best ingredients at the cheapest possible price and I'm saving to buy a bigger oven. That'll make a difference. And you only sell them to the restaurant owner? He asked. Yeah. You'd make more money selling them direct, he said. Of course I would, but then I'd have to set something up and pay rent and staff and all that. It's easier to deal with Miranda. She tells me ahead of time and I make them, simple. Anyway, what do you know about cupcakes? I know if they taste good. The ones you brought over last night were delicious, he said. I hope you saved Adam some. Nope. He was fast asleep when I ate them. What he doesn't know won't hurt him. Anyway, he'd eaten most of that red velvet cake, he told her. Jane giggled. You ate them all. You said you were waiting for after dinner. Nah. He had one after he woke. And to answer your question, I don't know anything about the food business, but I'm pretty good at numbers. I was just offering to help. That's what friends do. Seeing Tilly had finished her toast, she broke off another edge for her. Again, Tilly took it eagerly. Jane's mind wandered to Scott, and she hoped his threats were empty ones. Surely after what he'd done, he wouldn't be stupid enough to try to take Tilly from her? This was a problem she never thought she'd have to face. After that dreadful episode, Jane had given notice to her flatmates and to Miranda, and moved back to her parents' house in the Amish community. Months later, she discovered she was pregnant, and when she told her parents, they sent her to the bishop. She had told the bishop everything, and he understood and offered his support. Her mother and her father weren't as understanding and were too worried about her bringing shame upon their good name. Their good name meant more to them than she did. As for the rest of the community, most of them kept their distance. Jane stared at young Tilly. She'd never treat her daughter as her parents had treated her. It was unbelievable to Jane that her once loving parents could become so cold and cruel. Jane took another mouthful of tea. Is Adam sick or something? Is that why you're here? Well, he's old, he replied. That doesn't mean he's sick. He sighed. I might as well tell you if you can keep a secret. He looked intently into her eyes. Can you keep a secret, Jane? He asked. Chapter 8. Jane nodded. I can keep a secret, but you don't have to tell me. I know I don't, he grunted. Do you want to know or not? She gave a little giggle. Yeah, tell me. The truth of why I'm here is that my mother thought it would be good for me to come here to look for a wife, he said. Jane giggled and then laughed harder, holding her stomach. The release felt good, just what she needed. Japheth wasn't smiling. What's funny? He asked. She stopped long enough to ask, Nothing, but couldn't you find one in your own community? No, he replied. Gradually, the smile left her face. I don't think you'll have any trouble. He ripped off a portion of toast. I'm not so sure. I've been told I'm too fussy. Really? Well, what are you looking for in a wife? I don't think my list is too long, he told her. You have a list? She asked. Yeah, it's not written down anywhere. It's up here. He tapped his head. I don't really believe in love, but I figure if I marry at all, she must be beautiful, kind, patient, and nice to animals and old people like my grandfather. Is that it? No, there's more, but you look bored, he said. I'm interested, truly interested. Continue, please. She put her elbow on the table and placed her chin on the edge of her palm. She has to be kind, he said. You already said kind. What else do you want? She asked. He huffed. I'll know her when I see her. So you do believe in love then, if you'll know her? You believe she exists and she's out there somewhere? She asked. His dimples once again made an appearance. To tell you the truth, I haven't thought too much about it, he replied. But you thought enough about it to create that list. He frowned at her. Come on, tell me what else is on that list. He chuckled. You're making fun of me, cruelly mocking me. You'd know it if I was. I'm truly interested in what you have to say. Jane knew that he was looking for someone just as handsome as he was, He was probably the perfect man, and he was looking for someone equally as perfect. Start with age. How old would you like her to be? He eyed her skeptically. You really want to know? He asked. Jane glanced at Tilly to see her staring at Japheth. Look, even Tilly wants to know. He laughed when he saw Tilly staring up at him. Age is not something that's important, he replied. I don't want a young giggly girl, and neither do I want someone who's older than me, or who acts older. It's how old she is in the head that counts, and as well as kind, she must be clever and smart. Aren't they one and the same, clever and smart? She asked. If you keep interrupting, we won't get home before dark. I'm not sure how to describe the difference between clever and smart, but they're not the same thing to me. And I haven't asked yet. But do you want me to drive you two home? He asked. That would be wonderful, thank you. His eyes glistened as he spoke again of his ideal woman, explaining exactly how she should be. There were no surprises there. I'm not sure if I believe in love anyway, after all that. And what about you? He finally asked. What are you looking for in a husband? I'm not looking at all, she told him. Oh, come on. Everyone wants someone. He pushed his dark hair away from his face. So you're also a hypocrite? I'm learning so much about you. These things are nice to think about, but in reality, is love really what it's cracked up to be? He asked. I can't answer that. Anyway, Tilly and I are fine on our own. I make enough money for both of us, and we're all good. She filled her mouth with the last of the toasted sandwich. When she tried to chew, she realized she should have made it 2 or 3 bites, but it was too late. As she chewed, she covered her mouth with her hand. He drank the rest of his coffee in silence, and when Tilly threw her crust on the floor, he picked it up and put it on his own plate. When Tilly grunted with her hand out for the crust, he handed her the bottle of juice. Jane continued munching on the mouthful. Glad he hadn't given Tilly the food from the floor. She'd half expected he would. Have dinner with Adam and me tonight, he said. Thank you, that's kind, but maybe another night. It's pizza night tonight, he told her. You're having pizza? She asked, more interested. Yeah, and you said you'd have dinner with us sometime. She twirled one of the prayer cap strings around her finger. I thought I said maybe. I told Adam I'm bringing pizzas home for dinner. You won't have to suffer through my cooking and pretend to like it, he told her. That sounds tempting. I like pizzas. That settles it. You won't have to cook and there'll be no mess to clean up. You can leave me with all the dishes and go home whenever you feel like it, he said. She nodded. Thank you, I'd appreciate that. Try not to let that man bother you. He was probably only full of hot air, he said. I really hope you're right. Are you ready to go? He asked. She nodded. He got out of his chair first and then said, Are you all right? Do you need any help? No, it's fine. I'm used to doing everything on my own. She pulled Tilly out of the high chair and put her back into the stroller and buckled her in. Then they headed out of the cafe. My buggy's this way, and I already know where the pizza shop is. How do you know that? She asked. Adam told me, he replied. While Jane headed to the buggy, she hoped that Scott wasn't spying on her. She glanced around and couldn't see him, but she couldn't shake an awful feeling. When they got back to Adam's barn, Jane took Tilly home to change her diaper. While she was at her own house, she thought back to the last time she hadn't had to cook dinner. She'd had a couple of meals in the past year at Wendy's house, but that was the only break she'd had. Even though she didn't mind cooking, it was lovely to have a rest from it and from the washing up afterward. After she had made Tilly a bottle, they headed to Adam's house. There was something about Japheth that attracted her, and she knew she couldn't let that attraction develop. He wouldn't be so attentive if he didn't feel something for her as well. After tonight, she'd keep her distance. No one deserved to be tied down with someone with her problems. Seeing Scott Crittenden and hearing his threats, Jane knew there were even more problems heading her way. Now that Scott thought Tilly was his, he wasn't going to walk away and forget about it. Chapter 9. Jane normally traveled to the Sunday meetings with either Adam or Wendy's family. Today she chose to go with Wendy's family, figuring it didn't look good to arrive there with Japheth. No doubt if she had, there would have been talk, and she didn't want Japheth to be seen with her. It wouldn't give him the best chance of finding a woman. And because he'd shared his secret with her, she knew that was why he was there. She arrived before Japheth and Adam, and was sitting at the back of the room when they walked in. There were at least a dozen heads that turned to gawk at Japheth, and most of them were young women. Jane looked away, so he wouldn't see her and do something silly like wave. Jiggling Tilly on her knees, she turned and talked to Wendy. When the meeting was over, there was the customary meal afterward. Always hoping for reconciliation, Jane took the opportunity to talk to her mother. Now was a perfect opportunity as her mother was walking away from a lady having finished a conversation. "Mom." Jane's mother stopped still when she saw Jane, and Jane hurried over to her with her daughter in her arms. "That man has come back and says he's going to take Tilly away from me." "You should have married him. That's what you should have done." That was the Amish way for anyone who had relations before marriage, but that was not the case in this instance. Why couldn't her mother see that the situation was nothing near the same? He didn't want to marry me then, and he doesn't want to marry me now, and I'd never marry him no matter what. "What you just said is ridiculous," Jane told her mother. She licked her lips, aware that her voice was raised. She'd have to control her temper. Her mother glanced around and then spoke in a low voice. "I'll not talk to you if this is all you want to talk about. Don't you want to help me when I'm in trouble? You're old enough to have a baby, so you're old enough to work out your own problems," her mother told her. "It wasn't my choice. None of this was my choice. The only choice I made was not to have an abortion. What was I to do? This could have happened to anyone." Her mother just stared at her with cold brown eyes. "There's no point talking about this as though something has changed. Nothing has changed, and it never will. You made your decision." "There's nothing about this that was my decision. What would you have me do?" she asked her mother. "You've always been a stubborn girl." Her mother walked away from her. Jane didn't blame her. Not really. Her mother had toughened her heart against her because the truth of the situation was too awful to face. But Jane didn't have the luxury of looking the other way, or ignoring what had happened. Now she had Tilly. She had to face everything head on. There was no turning her back on the problem or the situation, as her parents and her siblings had done. One older sister, who had moved to a different community, had started writing to her and seemed sympathetic. She turned back to face the crowd that had gathered around the food tables. A crowd of girls was standing around Japheth in a semicircle. That didn't take long. Jane knew he'd be popular. As she normally did on Sundays, she sat down with Tilly on her lap, somewhere out of the way, and waited until Wendy's family was ready to go home. It was 6 o'clock in the morning and still pitch black outside. Listening harder, Jane heard the pitter-patter of rain on the roof. She closed her eyes again, enjoying the sound, which had gone from sprinkling to pelting down. It was then Jane remembered the leak just inside the back door. It hadn't rained for some time, and she'd removed the bucket that caught the drips. She switched on the gas lamp next to her and carefully made her way down the steps to the back door. Her heart sank when she heard the drips landing on the floor before she reached it. By the light of the lamp, she saw there was already water pooling on the floor. With the lamp still in her hands, she used her foot to push the tin bucket from its spot in the corner until it was under the leak. Then she looked up at the wet ceiling. Adam had been so good to her that she had delayed telling him about the leak, figuring she'd fix it herself just as soon as she found out how. She left the wet floor, intending to wipe it in the daylight. Catching a few more minutes of sleep was more important right at that moment. Jane raced back upstairs and slipped between the covers, pleased that the warm spot she'd left was still there. Later that afternoon, Wendy appeared in the kitchen and climbed over the makeshift fence that kept Tilly in the dining room. She picked Tilly up into her arms. "How was your day, Wendy?" "I went to Lizzie's house for the quilting bee. I told you I was going there, didn't I?" Wendy asked. "Yeah, I think so." Wendy talked so fast and about so many things that Jane lost track of what she was talking about most of the time. "Anyway, guess what was the topic of conversation?" "What?" Jane asked. "Japheth." Jane's eyebrows rose. "Our Japheth?" "Yeah, all the girls are in love with him." "He's not been here long enough, has he?" Jane asked with a giggle. "One Sunday meeting. That was enough," Wendy said. And what about you? How do you feel about him? Jane asked. What, for you? For you or for anyone in general, Jane said. He's more suited to you than anyone else. He's more your age, Wendy replied. Jane pressed her lips into a line. I told you about me and men. It's just not going to happen. You've got to get past that. You can't let what happened to you ruin your life, Wendy told her. I'm past the expiration date for that. A good part of my life has already been ruined. Anyway, all I want now is for Tilly to have a good life. That's all I'm concerned about, Jane said. You've got a long life ahead of you. You could live until you're 100. That's another 80 years. Tilly will probably leave home when she's 20 or even younger, and then you'll have 60 years alone. No, hang on. She held Tilly in one arm while she counted on her fingers. I think that's right. Can't I wait until Tilly leaves home and then think about it? The idea of Tilly leaving home filled her with horror, but there was a long time to go yet. Why did you have to say Tilly's going to leave home? Wendy laughed. Everyone leaves their parents' home sooner or later. You did, and I'll leave home soon. Everyone has to leave and start out on their own. I know that, but I would rather not think about it, Jane said. Worry lines appeared across Wendy's young forehead. Don't you ever think what it would be like to marry a nice man? I haven't thought about anything like that in a very long time. It's just something that's not going to happen for me. The time for all that has passed me by, and I don't even care. Wendy sat down on the floor with Tilly and then stacked up all her plastic plates. Let me know when you need me, Wendy said. Jane thought about what her life would have been like if she hadn't gone on Rumspringa and hadn't taken that job at that restaurant and gotten to know that terrible man. She most likely would have married one of the Amish men her age. All the men her age were now spoken for, and most of them were married. She had no idea which one she would have chosen. There was no one man who'd stood out from the others as being a better match for her than anyone else. Jane spooned the frosting mixture into the piping bag, and then piped the frosting high onto each cupcake. Miranda liked the frosting high, and so did her customers, and piping the frosting was Jane's favorite part of making the cupcakes. When she had one row ready, she called out to Wendy, I've got some ready for you now. I'll be there in a sec. Wendy stood, climbed over the fence, and washed her hands well before she opened the various containers of toppings. There's no particular themes for these ones? No, just do your usual thing, Jane said. You've got no interest in Japheth at all? Wendy asked. Jane laughed. He's nice. He's nice to have as a friend, and that's all. He's got no interest in me. Put your thoughts into those cakes. How could you possibly know that? Wendy asked. Know what? Jane asked. You just said he had no interest in you. That's right, and I know that from the things we talked about. He said things to me he wouldn't say to me if he was thinking of me as a potential wife. Like what? Wendy asked. It doesn't matter, just forget it. What? You've got to tell me now, Wendy said. Jane sighed. I can't say because he might not want me to repeat it. You know what I mean? I don't want to repeat things and then be accused of gossiping. Okay. I guess if I was young and carefree and all this hadn't happened to me, I don't really know how I'd feel. I can't turn back the clock, so there's no use thinking about it. When they heard a mower start up, Jane smiled. It looks like I'm about to get my lawn mowed. Japheth? Jane nodded. Wendy raised her eyebrows and remained silent. Chapter 10. Bye, Jane. I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you for your help, Wendy. See you tomorrow. Wendy headed out the back door now that their work was done, and Miranda had picked up the order. With the day having grown cold, Jane headed to the living room and made a fire in readiness for a chilly evening. There was nothing she liked more than drinking a cup of hot tea and staring into the flames after Tilly was in bed. It was therapeutic to do nothing and think of nothing after a hectic day. As Jane went back into the kitchen, she heard Wendy talking to someone by the back door. Japheth's here, Wendy called out. Can I come in? Japheth said from the back door as he knocked. Come in, Jane said. When he didn't appear in the kitchen, Jane looked around the corner to see where he was. He was staring at the bucket of water in the corner. Then he looked up at the ceiling, and then he looked at Jane. What's this? Oh, it's a small leak, Jane said. It doesn't look too small to me, he replied. It happens every time it rains heavily. I haven't gotten around to fixing it yet. I'll get up in the roof and see what's wrong with it, he said. Thank you, and it was good of you to mow the lawn. Thank you for that too, she replied. You're welcome. Have you told Adam about the leak? He asked. No, I don't like to bother him. He gives me this place so cheaply. The last thing he'd need would be me complaining about it. That's where you're wrong, Jane. He'd want this house to be in good condition. It's not much work to fix a few things here and there, like this leak, he told her. Jane grimaced. I was worried that it might need a new roof. He chuckled. No, I think the roof is quite good. I'll get a ladder and I'll be back. I just opened a bottle of soda. How about a glass of that first and have a sit down before you do anything? I've just lit the fire. He nodded. Okay. As soon as he sat down and had swallowed a mouthful, he started on her. You really should socialize with people more. I think you're wrong about most people. They're not judging you or thinking bad things about you at all. I'm the one who grew up here, remember? I know how people around here think. It's probably different where you come from, she replied. Once you get to spend time with them, you'll realize how wrong you've been. Avoiding people won't help the situation, he said. Here's the problem. I don't fit in with the young marrieds who sit around and talk about their husbands, what their husbands want, how their husbands want their food cooked, and how they're doing this and that for them. So what am I going to talk about? I'm not having any more children. That's something they talk about all the time too. And I don't have a husband. And then there's the young people's group. I've got Tilly, so I can't be one of them. I can't bring her to all the young people's events. She told him something of the kind at the cafe, but like all men, it probably went in one ear and out the other. You could leave her with someone when you go, he suggested. Jane pulled a face. I don't like leaving her with anyone. Or you can take her to the young marrieds, he said. She shook her head. I don't have time for all that. People always think that just because I work from home, I can do anything I want throughout the day. I can't. Right after Tilly and I have breakfast, I cook the rest of the day. I have a break in the middle of the day when the last of the cakes are cooling, and then in the afternoon it's frosting, decorating, and packaging. And even at night, if I'm not too tired, I get a head start on the next day by creaming the butter and the sugar ready for the morning. Where would I find time to socialize and go to any of these things? I see what you mean. It must be hard, he said. It is. Not that I'm complaining. I'm just telling it like it is. Who are your friends? He asked. There's really only Wendy and her family and the bishop's wife and one of the bishop's daughters, Ruth. Is that all? He asked. That's all I need. I just told you how busy I am, she said. He leaned back. Don't get cranky with me, I was just asking. I'm not cranky, she replied. He laughed. I've heard that girls with red hair have fiery tempers. She pulled out a strand that had escaped the confines of her prayer cap. My hair's not red. Staring at her hair, he said, I see some red strands there. When you're in the sun, it's even more red. Oh, I forgot Adam, Jane said, ignoring his intense interest in the color of her hair. What? He asked. Adam's a friend too. He drew his eyebrows together. My grandfather? Yeah. Oh, good. An 80-year-old man who sits on the couch and does nothing all day is one of your best friends, he said. She nodded. You can think that's funny if you like, but he's done so much for me. He's done more than my family has done for me. You mean leasing this house from him? He asked. Yeah. When I was in trouble, he spoke to me at one of the meetings and said his tenants had just moved out. He's letting me rent it for practically nothing. If it weren't for him, I'd have nowhere to live. I'd be homeless. My parents wouldn't have me back. He shook his head. I find that so hard to believe. It's probably not uncommon. That doesn't make it right. Surely the bishop could have a word with your parents about it, he said. It's easier to not let it bother me. They've forgotten about me, so I have to forget about them. It makes me more determined to be a better parent to Tilly, and to be kind and compassionate to others. When dimples appeared in Japheth's cheeks, she remembered him continually saying he wanted a kind woman. She cleared her throat. You better fix that roof before dark. He rose to his feet as he chuckled. I don't know if it'll be that easy. I'll be back soon. Thank you for the conversation and the soda, he said. Jane bit her tongue to stop herself from telling him. It wasn't a conversation. It was more of a lecture, since most of the time he'd been giving her advice. Tilly was yawning. There was no way she'd make it through to bedtime without falling asleep. She'd already had her 2 daily naps. If she slept now, hopefully she'd wake up by herself in time for the evening meal. Otherwise, she'd be one cranky little girl if Jane had to wake her. Jane had just put Tilly down to sleep when she heard a car pull up outside the house. She pulled aside the curtains in Tilly's room aside and saw Scott Crittenden closing his car door. Frozen in fear, she wondered how he'd found out where she lived. She raced to the door, intent on telling him once and for all to leave them alone. Chapter 11. She flung the door open before he knocked, stepped outside, and quickly closed the door behind her so he wouldn't think he could go inside. "How did you know I lived here?" she spat out. "It wasn't too hard to find out, especially when I have friends in high places," he told her. "I told you my child has nothing to do with you." He sniggered while looking her up and down. "I can't believe that." "Leave now, or I'll call the police." "No need to get them involved. I'm not doing anything at all, unlike you, keeping my kid from me," he said as he glared at her. "Leave," she demanded. "I'm going. I just came to give you this." He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a letter and thrust it at her. "And you'll soon get another ordering you to get the kid DNA tested. I wonder what that will reveal, eh?" He squinted his eyes at her. "You can't do that." "I did. The ball's already rolling." She ripped up the letter in front of him and screamed at him. "Go, just go." Over his shoulder, Japheth appeared, dropped the ladder by the barn, and hurried over. "Is everything all right, Jane?" he asked, looking worried. "No, it's not." "You better go," Japheth called out to Scott Crittenden as he strode toward him. Scott didn't acknowledge Japheth and kept his cold-hearted eyes fixed on Jane. "You haven't heard the last of this. You can't keep me from her forever. You'd better be careful, or I won't even allow you to see her when I'm granted full custody. My lawyers are doing their research for the case as we speak," he said. Japheth stepped in between them. "You've upset her enough. It'd be better if you left," he demanded. Scott laughed at him, and as he did so, Jane balled her hands into fists and charged at Scott, knocking him back as she hit him repeatedly. Japheth pulled her away. "Come on, Jane. It's okay," he told her. She cried, "It's not okay, it's not." Scott backed away and said to Japheth, "You'd better keep her under control." When he got into his car, Jane tried to run at him again, but Japheth held on to her. As he drove away, Jane burst into tears. Japheth still had his arm around her. "What's going on?" he asked. She shook her head. "He's trying to take Tilly away from me." "He's the father?" he asked. "In name only. Why didn't you let me punch him?" she asked. "You did." Japheth shook his head. "Violence doesn't get anyone anywhere." It made me feel a little better. "Just calm down." He gestured toward the house. "Go inside out of the cold." With his arm around her shoulder, he walked her into her house. "Sit down on the couch. I'll make you a cup of coffee, or would you like something a bit stronger?" "I don't have anything strong. I normally don't drink alcohol, but I've got a feeling that's about to change." "Coffee coming up," he said. "No tea, please? Coffee will only keep me awake." He left her to stare at the fire while he made hot tea. As she stared into the flickering flames, she wondered what would happen now. She looked around for the letter he'd handed her and recalled that she'd ripped it up and left it outside. It was a silly thing to tear it up. Just as she stood to go outside to retrieve the remnants of the letter, Japheth appeared in the room. "Where are you going?" he asked. "I'm just going to see what the letter said." "What letter?" "He handed me a letter from a lawyer, and I ripped it up and left it outside." "You stay there. I'll get it." He stared at her intently and pointed to the couch until she sat back down. Seconds later, the pieces of the letter were in her hands. She pieced it together on the couch beside her. It wasn't from a lawyer like he'd made out. It was just a letter from Scott stating his intentions. He could have told her all that himself. But because he was such a sneaky person, she figured there'd be a reason for him giving her that letter. "What does it say?" Japheth placed a tray on the small table to the side of her. It held a small pot of tea and a floral-patterned cup and saucer. Thank you. It's not from a lawyer. He probably figured I'd rip it up. It was from him saying he's going to get custody, and he's going to force me to get Tilly DNA tested," she told him. "Why put that in a letter? That wasn't necessary, was it? It seems to me he wanted to see you again," he told her. "Knowing him like I do, there'd be a reason for him handing me this letter. It's probably some legal loophole for him to show the court he's done all the right things, and that way he can make out that I'm the bad one." Japheth sat down opposite her. "Did you know him well?" he asked. "He was a regular at Miranda's restaurant. I worked there for a year when I was on Rumspringa. He was there nearly every night. He had a friend, a guy called Bonnie, and they'd both stay on after closing and drink with the staff." "Ah, you knew him reasonably well then?" he asked. "As well as you ever really know anyone. He asked me out on a date, and I was stupid enough to say yes. I thought he was a nice guy. Everyone thought he was. He put something in my drink that night and assaulted me. I have vague memories, and that's all." She shook her head. "I'm so sorry that happened to you." He shook his head. "Thank you. It was a long time ago," she replied. "Something like that would stay with you," he said. "It did, and it does. I suppose you heard about that anyway. Have you heard talk about me?" "Nothing. Don't look so worried," he told her. "Well, wouldn't you be worried if it was all happening to you and someone was now threatening to take your child away? The worst person in the world?" "Probably. But there must be things you can do about it. He's doing legal things, so perhaps you should get a lawyer," he advised. I should have kept calm and then told him that there was no way he could take her from me. "Yeah, it's always best to remain calm," he replied. "Too late for that now." She grabbed the letter. "His address is here. I should go to his place and tell him calmly that it's not going to happen. He wouldn't risk anyone finding out what really happened. He must be scared I'll say something." Japheth shook his head. "You should keep your distance. Don't do it," he told her. Chapter 12. "Why not?" Jane asked. "If he thinks I'll go to the police, he might back off." Japheth shook his head. "Don't. It's not a good idea that you go anywhere near him. If you hit him like you just did, he could have you arrested for assault." Jane gasped. "You're right." "That would make it easier for him to take legal action against you," he told her. "What should I do?" Jane asked, looking down at the ripped pieces of paper. "Why don't you write him a letter?" he suggested. She looked up at him. "A letter?" "Yeah, you can say what you want, and you'll have time to think it all over in a calm and cool manner," he replied. "You're right. That's a good idea. I'll write a letter. I'll do it tonight, and I'll send it tomorrow." "Good idea. Would you rather be left alone to write, or do you want me to hang around a little longer?" he asked her. "Please stay a while. You've got a calming effect on me." He smiled. "Do I?" "It's not a compliment. Not that big of a one, anyway." "Coming from you, I think it is," he said with a massive smirk on his face. Any other time she would have laughed, but that was the last thing she felt like. Again, she looked down at the ripped letter on the couch. "Drink your tea, Jane. It'll make you feel better," he told her. Her eyes fell to the tray with the empty cup and the small teapot. "Thank you. You'll make someone a good wife one day." "Very funny. Can you just stop making those comments for one moment and be serious?" she said as she frowned. "I will," he replied. He leaned forward, poured the tea into the cup, and carefully passed it to her on its matching saucer. Jane took the saucer with one hand and the cup with the other, pleased that he was still there trying to help her. "Thank you. I'm sorry. I don't know why I keep being mean to you. I'm not an awful person. Well, maybe I am, but I never used to be, at least." "It's because you're upset, and when you're upset, you take things out on those closest to you, your friends," he replied. She grimaced at him, calling himself a friend. "Anyway, you gave me some good advice about the letter thing. I'll state all the facts clearly about why he should never be allowed anywhere near Tilly." "Good. Mention how he's lucky that you didn't go to the cops when he did what he did," he told her. Jane sipped her tea. "Really? Do you think I should mention that? It might make him angry." "I think you have to mention it because you could still report him, couldn't you? You could still have him charged," he replied. "I guess so. But after all this time, no one would believe it, especially now with him wanting custody. It'll look like I'm making it up to stop him." She shook her head. "I have no proof," she said sadly. "Just be sure that whatever you say in the letter is calm and controlled. That way you'll get your point across much better and he'll see you're not scared of him. If you carry on like you did just now, he'll think he's got a better chance of winning," he told her. "Yeah, I know you're right." "I'm what?" he asked as he leaned over, touching his ear. She laughed. "You're right." He raised his eyebrows and the dimples in his cheeks made an appearance. "That's what I thought you said. Do you mind me asking where you got a name like Tilly from?" Jane knew he was taking her mind off the altercation to calm her down. "I can't remember. I heard it somewhere. I didn't have a name for her for about 3 days after she was born. Everyone kept suggesting names and nothing fitted until someone said the name Tilly, and I thought it just suited her." He nodded. "It does." She sighed. "I haven't worked so hard and gone through everything to have her taken away from me. That's not going to happen. I can't let it happen. It'd kill me." "I'll pray for you and Tilly and this whole situation," he told her. "You will?" she asked. "Of course I will. Why wouldn't I?" "Thank you. That's very kind of you. And I'll pray for you to find a wife." He chuckled. "You don't have to pray for something for me just because I'm praying for something for you." Jane looked downward. "It's not like that." "I don't need any prayer," he told her. "That confident, are you?" she asked. He laughed. "Not really. I'm just trying to make things easier for you and trying to be a good friend." "A good friend would just drink his tea and be quiet." He looked down at the mug in his hands. "It's coffee." "Whatever." Chapter 13. Japheth and Jane sat in silence by the warmth of the crackling fire for several minutes, and neither one of them said a word. "You're good company," she finally said. When he didn't speak, she looked over at him. "Can I talk now?" he asked. "Yeah." "Thank you. That's the nicest thing anyone said to me for a while, especially when I haven't said a thing," he told her. She screwed up her face. "What was nice?" "You said I'm good company," he replied. "You are. You made me tea and kept me calm. As well as that, you gave me good advice." He drank the last of his coffee. "I should go," he said. "If anyone sees me in your house this late at night." "Your reputation will be ruined. Mine will remain the same," she said. He gave a low chuckle. "I'll go back and talk to Adam and see what he wants to tell me about. He reads every paper and always has something interesting to tell me," he said. "The Amish papers?" she asked. "Yeah, they're the only ones he reads, of course. Then I have to hear what everyone's been doing. It's boring, but he seems so happy to talk about it that I just have to sit there and listen," he replied. "He must be enjoying having you here. Tell him I'm sorry that I don't have cupcakes for him today. I needed every one of them. The orders were all divisible by 12, she said. "Do I need to add that last bit?" he asked. "No. Well, you can if you like. He'll know. He stops by from time to time and I tell him about my cakes," she replied. "I forgot that Adam's another friend of yours," he said with a giggle. "Yeah, he is. I've been meaning to ask you, why do you call him Adam?" she asked. "I don't do it to his face. You told me you had no friends, but you've got Adam, Wendy, and me. So that's 3, he replied. "I don't think I told you I had no friends." "I think you did," he said with a smile. She sniggered and made an unladylike snort from the back of her nose, which she hadn't meant. "What's that sound for?" he asked. "You haven't been here long enough to figure things out, so I'll tell you how it works." She shook her head. "I don't know how things work where you come from, but around here the start is the finish. People avoid me now, and they'll avoid me always. I'm unmarried and I've got a child. As far as my parents are concerned, it's irrelevant how that came about. My mother says, the facts are the facts, which means I'm unmarried and I have a child. It wasn't your fault. If anything, they should be nice to you," he said. "Even if the child came about the proper way, with 2 consenting parents. What happened to forgiveness?" he asked. "It's all about appearances. My parents think people should abstain from the appearance of evil, and apparently I didn't, and I haven't. I don't know what they think I should do, just make Tilly disappear or something." He shook his head. "It's not right." "I know, but that's how things are. People are never going to treat me the same no matter how Tilly came into this world. They can't help it. Half of them don't know what happened, but they must guess since I wasn't shunned and didn't have to confess the sin in front of the congregation, she said. Yeah, they'd surely put 2 and 2 together, he replied. You'd think so. Anyway, I'm happy as I am doing my cupcakes and caring for Tilly, and I've got no time for a social life or for people to stop by and chatter mindlessly about nothing. That's a shame, he said. Tell me about it. Going back to what we were talking about before, I think my parents believe I made it all up and lied to the bishop so I can stay on in the community and avoid a shunning, she told him. He shook his head. It's not fair. It mightn't be fair, but things will never change. People are just scared. My parents are scared people will think less of them, think they were bad parents or something. Were they? He asked. I didn't think so until this happened. They weren't there when I needed them. I'd never do that to Tilly, she replied. He stood up and looked in her cup. Still drinking? Yeah. Leave your cup there. I'll wash it later, she replied. I can do it before I go, he told her. Leave it, she snapped. Yes, ma'am, he replied as he raised his eyebrows. I'm sorry, I've been mean to you again and you've only been nice to me. You're under a lot of pressure, he said sympathetically. She nodded. I'll feel a lot better once I write that letter. I'll go, but you know where I am if you need anything. He made his way to the front door. She jumped up. Wait. Yeah? Could you do me a huge favor? She asked. Sure, he replied. Can you post the letter tomorrow for me? Once it's on its way, I'll feel a whole lot better. He nodded. I'll stop by first thing and take it to the post office. I'll have to get to fixing that leak another day. Anything else? He asked. No, thank you. After he had flashed her a smile, he walked out the door. As she listened to his footsteps stomp down the porch steps, she looked back at the fire. The heat warmed her face while she sat and figured out exactly what to write in that letter. Chapter 14. Jane woke up from the best night's sleep she'd had for some time. She looked at the clock to see that it was 6:30. Tilly was babbling to herself in her bedroom. Since she'd woken early and it didn't seem cold, Jane decided to take Tilly for a walk after breakfast. After a quick shower, Jane pulled on her day dress and unpinned her long hair. Once she was dressed and had redone her hair, she walked into Tilly's room to see her standing up, hanging onto the railing of her crib. You don't have a care in the world, do you? Tilly reached her arms up and Jane leaned down and pulled her out of the crib. Then she changed Tilly's diaper and dressed her for the day before they headed downstairs. Even though Saturday was the same as any other workday, it always felt different. Things seemed slower and more relaxed somehow, and Jane was more tempted to have a rest in between times, rather than continue with the frantic pace she kept up every weekday. After a breakfast of eggs and toast, she placed a blanket around Tilly before placing her in her stroller. She pushed the stroller over the small white pebbles of the driveway to the wide road where there was plenty of room to move to one side if she happened to see a buggy or a car. Tilly was sitting upright, staring around about her. Putting chores and work out of her mind, Jane enjoyed being out in the early morning sun and watching the soft light filter through the low branches of the trees. Everything seemed more positive and brighter when the sun was out, even though the morning air was chilly. The walk cleared her mind, and if it weren't so cold, she would have gone further. That's it, Tilly. We'll walk again tomorrow if it's a nice day. She turned the stroller around and headed back. When they were level with the back of Adam's house, she saw Japheth hitching Adam's buggy. Japheth looked up and saw her. Hi, Jane, he said. Hello, you're having an early start. I'm helping Michael Stolfoots repair the roof of his barn, he told her. That's good of you, she replied with a smile. On my way, I'll post that letter of yours if you have it ready, he said. I do. I'll just get it for you. Jane headed to the house, left Tilly in the stroller at the bottom of the stairs, ran inside, grabbed the letter that was already sealed and stamped, and hurried out again. She pushed Tilly back to where Japheth was and stood there watching him adjust the horse's harness. He looked at her and smiled. Then he walked over to crouch down and talk to Tilly. Tilly reached out to him and he held up his hands. I can't touch you after I've been touching the horse. Your mom wouldn't be too happy with me, he said. He glanced over at Jane as he stood up. "You've got that right. Here's the letter," she said. "Good. I hope this is all that's needed," he replied. "Me too. You'll be gone for the whole day?" "Possibly. Do you need me to bring you back anything from in town?" he asked. "No, thank you, and no cake either," she said. His eyes twinkled. "I learned that lesson," he replied. "Wave bye-bye to Japheth, Tilly." Tilly lifted her hand and waved. Japheth chuckled and waved back. "Bye, Japheth," Jane said as she turned the stroller around to head back to the house. Chapter 15. Several days later. As Jane was pulling the last batch of cakes out of the oven, she heard a car. She set down the cakes, flicked off the gas, and walked the 2 steps to the kitchen window, surprised to see a police car coming up the shared driveway. She was even more surprised when they pulled up outside her door. Assuming they must be after directions, she opened the door. When an officer got out of the car, she walked to the edge of the porch. "Can I help you?" A second uniformed officer got out and closed his door. They both ignored what she said and walked toward her. The bigger one reached the porch first. "We're looking for a Jane Byler." "That's me. I'm Officer Davies, and this is Officer Williams. We need you to come down to the station and answer some questions," he told her. She looked from him to the other officer and back to the one who'd spoken. "What's this about?" "Scott Crittenden was found dead in his apartment this morning." She gasped and held her stomach. "Scott?" "That's right, ma'am. Scott Crittenden," he replied. "Are you sure it was him?" "Yes," he said firmly. She froze and could only stare at the man in disbelief. "Are you sure? I only saw him the other day." Her knees went weak, and she collapsed onto the top step. "We're sure. We need you to come with us. We've got some questions we'd like you to answer." "What did he die from?" she asked. "He was murdered," he replied. "Murdered," she muttered quietly, trying to become accustomed to a second shock. "Miss Byler, we need you to come with us." "Can you ask the questions here? I've got my baby here," she said. "It's quite a serious matter, ma'am. We need to ask you a few questions regarding your relationship with him," he replied. "I had no relationship with him. Do you think I had something to do with his murder?" When they didn't answer her, she said, "I didn't do it." "All the same, we'll need you to come down to the station," he said again. "I can't leave. I've got work. I work from home and I've got no one here to mind the baby and she's asleep right now." The policemen looked at each other, Officer Williams raising his eyebrows in a quizzical manner. She quickly added, "I'll find someone to look after the baby and then I can come as soon as I finish work at around 4 or just after 4. I cook for a catering company and I need to get the work done. It's my sole income. If I let my boss down, I might not get any more work and my baby and I will starve." The officer put up his hands. "Just be there at 4. She nodded. "I will." "Ask for Officer Davies," he said. "I will." She watched as they walked back to their car. Just as they drove away, she looked up to see Japheth walking toward her. "What was that all about?" he asked. "Scott's dead." He gasped. "Really?" She nodded. "I'm worried about the letter." His eyes grew wide. "Why?" She didn't answer, and then he asked, "Jane, what was in the letter?" "Nothing too bad. I didn't think so at the time anyway." She held her head. "I can't believe he's dead. He was murdered and they want to ask me questions about it. They want me to go to the station when I finish work." "They don't think you did it, do they?" he asked. "I'm not sure." She held her stomach. "I'll have to finish this order. Wendy can look after Tilly while I go." "I can look after her," he told her. She stared at him. "You told me don't know the first thing about babies." "It can't be too hard," he said. "What if she's not home?" "I'll leave her with Wendy's mother." "Can I do anything to help you get the order out?" he asked. "If you don't mind, that would be good of you," she replied. He nodded, rolled up his sleeves, and followed her through to the kitchen. She handed him an apron. "Seriously?" he asked. "You said you want to help." She pointed to liquid soap by the sink. "Wash your hands, too." When he'd washed and dried his hands, he turned around. "What do I do now?" he asked. "While I'm mixing the frosting, you can put the cupcakes into the paper casings over there." She nodded her head to the signature casings that Miranda provided for the cupcakes, bright pink with white polka dots. "Okay." He carefully picked up each cupcake and placed it into its casing. "We'll be here all day if you do it that way," she said. "It's faster if you make rows of casings than pop the batter in and do it quickly." "Don't be too hard on me. I'm a beginner," he said as he glanced over at her. "Don't worry, it'll be fine. You'll see," he assured her. "What if they do think I killed him?" she asked, mortified. "They'll need proof, and they don't have any because you didn't do it," he told her. "You hear of innocent people going to jail all the time. And then there's the letter I sent him," she said as she bit her lip. "Why? What was in it?" he asked. When she didn't say anything, he looked up. "Jane, what did you write in the letter?" he asked again, his voice a little raised this time. "I just mentioned I'd kill him if he didn't stay away from me." His eyes opened wide and his mouth fell open. "What? You threatened him?" he asked. She nodded. "I was desperate. I can't have her taken away. She's all I've got and I'm all she's got. It's not as though I really meant it." Tears began to fall down her face. "You agreed you'd be calm, don't you remember?" he said. "I know. It started out that way and then I remembered how horrible he was and what he'd done. I got angry and then the letter took a different turn," she replied. "If they find out that the two of you were heading for a legal battle over Tilly, you might be the prime suspect. I'm guessing they don't have one of those since they came here to see you." "How is that supposed to make me feel better?" she asked. "This is serious, Jane," he replied. "I know it is. You don't have to tell me." "And if they've got that letter, that'll make you look guilty," he told her. Jane chewed on a fingernail. "What should I do?" "You've still got his address?" he asked. Jane nodded. "We'll have to go to his apartment and get that letter back," he said. "Break in?" She frowned. "Yeah. What choice do we have?" he asked. "You'd do that for me?" she asked. He frowned at her. "I'd do it for Tilly so her mother doesn't go to jail for the rest of her life, or worse." "It's no use. They've probably got it already and that's why they came here." She shook her head. "They didn't arrest you straight away, so that's a good sign," he assured her. "That's only because there's no law against writing an angry letter. Anyway, they would have gone right through his apartment by now looking for clues to who might have killed him. They would have the letter." "I'll drive you to the police this afternoon," he told her. "That's okay, I'll catch a taxi. It'll be quicker." He shook his head. "I'll go with you in the taxi then, for moral support." She looked up at him. "You'd do that?" she asked. "Be quiet. I'm concentrating on my job," he said. Jane smiled at Japheth paying her back for telling him to be quiet days before. It felt good to have someone on her side. When the contents of the letter flew through her mind, the thought instantly wiped the smile from her face. Half an hour later, Tilly woke from her nap in the downstairs crib just as Wendy walked through the front door. After Wendy said hello to Japheth and Jane, she climbed over the railing of the dining room and picked Tilly up. "Sorry I'm a little late. Mom had me doing spring cleaning and rug cleaning, which is the worst kind of cleaning. Is the order ready or do you need help?" She glanced at Jane's face and then looked at Japheth. "What's wrong?" "Scott's dead," Jane said. Wendy's mouth fell open. "The Scott?" Jane nodded. "How?" she asked. Japheth answered. "The police said he's been murdered. They want to talk to Jane. We're taking a taxi to the station as soon as Miranda collects the order." Wendy's gaze traveled back to Jane. "Do you want me to look after Tilly?" "Thank you. I was hoping you would." "Of course I will. Do you want us to stay here or will I take her home? How long will you be?" Wendy asked. Jane glanced over at Japheth. "I'm not sure." Japheth said, "Perhaps Wendy should take Tilly to her house in case we're a long time." "You're going with her?" Wendy asked Japheth. He nodded. "I am." "That's good," Wendy said as she patted Tilly on her back. "I'll make up some bottles." "She's just started drinking from a small cup," Jane told her. "I know, but she still likes her bottle, and with her mom not there, she'll need comfort." Jane didn't like to hear about her not being there. "Thank you, Wendy. I shouldn't be too long, I hope not anyway. I'm sure they just want to ask a few questions, Wendy said. Jane said, Japheth's been a big help today. We just need to box everything now. Jane glanced at the clock and saw it was 15 minutes before Miranda would arrive. Chapter 16. As soon as Jane asked for Officer Davies and said who she was ushered into an interview room, leaving Japheth sitting in the waiting area at the front of the station. We'll be recording this interview, the officer said as Jane was directed to a chair behind a table in the center of the room. Jane nodded. Okay. Would you like a lawyer or anyone to sit with you? He asked. No, it's fine. I don't need a lawyer. It'll be a few minutes while we get the equipment set up. Would you like coffee or anything? He asked. No, I'm fine, she replied. The officer walked out of the room and Jane looked around and saw 2 cameras set high in the corners of the room. She fiddled nervously with her fingers on the table, then moved them down to under the table in case they were watching already and she appeared too nervous. 2 officers came into the room and sat in front of her. They were the same ones who'd come to her house earlier that day. When they sat down, Officer Davies said, Can you state your full name for the record? Jane May Byler. What is your relationship to Scott Crittenden? He asked. We had no relationship, she replied. Let me ask in a different way. When did you first meet him? I used to work in a restaurant and he'd come in nearly every day. He asked me out on a date nearly 2 years ago, and then he drugged me and raped me, she said. Davies moved uncomfortably in his seat. Did you report it? He asked. I didn't see any point. I didn't think anyone would believe me and his family is wealthy. She left out the part about feeling ashamed and not wanting anyone to know what had happened. If she could put it out of her mind, it would be like the dreadful incident had never happened. Or so she'd thought. The awful feeling of being so powerless and the feeling of being unclean had never left her. We have a letter that you wrote to Scott. It was on his table and we found him slumped over the letter. Do you remember what you wrote? Officer Williams asked. No, not really. I was quite upset when I wrote it. Can I see it? She asked. We have it in evidence. You can read the transcript, he told her. Jane nodded. The officer opened a file in front of him, pulled out a sheet of paper and put it in front of her. She picked it up and her eyes fell to the part where she said that she would kill him if he ever came near her or Tilly again. She looked up at them. I didn't mean I'd really kill him. It's just what people say when they're mad. That's what we need to find out. When was the last time you saw the deceased? He asked. I don't know. A few days ago, maybe. The day I wrote the letter. She looked down at the date on the copy of the letter and read it out. Tell me about the conversation you had with him that last time you saw him. He came to my home earlier that day. When I saw him in town before then, he got the idea he was Tilly's father. I denied it and he insisted it was true, so we had an argument. Was he the father of your child? He asked. Yes, she replied. But you told him he wasn't. Jane nodded. That's right. What rights could he have after what he did to me? The 2 officers exchanged glances. I didn't kill him, and if you think I did, you're wasting your time. Anger rose within her. You should be out questioning someone else and trying to find the real killer. Davies remained strangely calm. It's convenient for you now that he's gone. What do you mean? She asked. He's dead and he won't be bothering you anymore. It's clear from your letter you were expecting a huge fight over custody, he told her. Yes, it's convenient. But I didn't kill him. I'd never kill anybody, she said firmly. I've had a lot to do with the Amish people, and I do find it strange for someone of your faith saying you'd kill someone. From what I know of the Amish, they're a peace-loving people. Most of them anyway, he said as he eyed her suspiciously. All I wanted was for him to stay away from me. I just wanted him to know that I was serious, she said. Serious about killing him? He asked. Serious that I wanted him to stay away, she replied. Would you submit to a polygraph test? The officer asked her. A what? A lie detector test. It measures physiological indices, pulse, blood pressure, respiration. She pressed her lips together. No. Why not, if you've got nothing to hide? He asked with a raised eyebrow. I don't want to do anything like that. I didn't do it and I just want to go home. It could look bad for you that you've refused, he told her. Jane was scared in case the test was faulty and pointed to her being guilty. It wasn't a risk she was willing to take. Do I have to do it? No. Who would it look bad to? Jane asked. Then William said, if you didn't kill him, it would be in your best interest to do a polygraph test. She shook her head. The truth will come out. Officer Davies leaned forward, close enough she could smell his body odor. I don't think you realize the trouble you're in. If we find any evidence you were in his apartment, things will be even worse for you, he said. I wasn't there. I was home all day baking. He was killed during the night, Davies said. Now let's go back to when Mr. Crittenden came to your house. What did he say? He said he was going to get custody of Tilly. Is that your daughter's name? He asked. Yes, Tilly Byler. The officer jotted it down. Is Tilly? It's just Tilly. And what was your response? He asked. I told him I'd never allow it, and he would never get Tilly when I told people what he'd done. He laughed and said no one would believe me. And I guess that's right because I didn't report it at the time, she said. He made you angry. You felt threatened and afraid of losing your daughter, he asked. Jane nodded. Yes. Was it self-defense? You went to see him to talk things through and things got heated. Is that what happened? He asked. No, I told you I wasn't at his house, apartment, or wherever he was staying. After a long pause, Davy said, Things will go a lot better for you if you tell us the truth now. He shook his head. I am telling you the truth. How much longer is this going to take? Jane asked. As long as it takes you to tell us the truth, he replied. Jane said a silent prayer to God asking him to get her out of the mess she was in. I didn't do it, and I think that if you thought I did, you would have already arrested me by now. We're waiting on the lab test to come back, as I said. This isn't done by far. Jane rubbed her forehead, feeling a headache coming on. I can't have been the only person to be upset with him, surely. It seems you are. Everyone else we've spoken with has only had good things to say about him. I find that hard to believe. You can't be asking the right people. He's not a nice person. Who have you been asking? His family? She asked. The people you used to work with back when you claim you were raped. That's who we've asked. He was very popular among the staff and they claim you had a special relationship with him, he told her. That was before he did what he did. I'd thought of him as a friend anyway, she replied. The questions went around and around in circles like that for the next hour, and then she was free to go. Jane headed to the waiting room after she signed her statement. She found Japheth in the waiting area. He leaped to his feet as soon as he saw her. How did it go? He asked. Dreadful, she replied. He clasped both her hands. You're shaking. What did they say? She looked around about her and whispered, They think I did it. Surely they don't. He shook his head in disbelief. They just don't have enough evidence yet to arrest me, she told him. His eyes widened. Is that what they said? Jane nodded. Just as they were leaving the waiting room, a small woman with heavily lacquered tall black hair stepped in front of her. Are you Jane Byler? She was almost scared to say yes from the look of the woman. I am. Where's my granddaughter? Who are you? I'm Scott's mother, the older woman replied. Jane looked down. I'm sorry about your son. Tears streamed down the woman's face. My granddaughter. She's not here. You can't keep her away from us. You're a dreadful, dreadful woman. I'm taking you to court, the old woman said angrily. Jane opened her mouth to speak, but Japheth took a firm hold of her arm and started walking, taking her along with him. Don't say a thing, Jane, he told her. All she could do was trust Japheth and listen to him because she was too upset and worked up to think clearly. You made up the story about my son and you'll be sorry. He told me what really happened. You won't get away with it, the woman called after her. Jane freed herself from Japheth's grasp and turned around. When did he tell you? She asked. 2 days ago. I know about girls like you who go after men with money. You deliberately got pregnant to latch onto him. You probably killed him too. Jane turned back, broke out of Japheth's grasp, and said to the woman, I don't want any. Japheth pulled on her arm, moving her away again. As soon as they were outside the police station, he hailed a passing taxi and guided her into the back seat before he climbed in after her. When he barked out his address to the driver, Jane put both hands over her face and sobbed. Japheth moved closer and put his arm around her. "It'll work out," he said. "I'm in a dreadful nightmare. I thought things were bad enough and now they just got worse, much worse. They didn't believe anything I said." Chapter 17. When they pulled up near the house, Wendy walked over from her house, holding Tilly and the diaper bag. "What happened?" Wendy asked. "It's a long story." "I'll make us tea," Wendy said after she handed Tilly to her mother. Tilly put her arms around her mother's neck and put her head on her shoulder. Wendy patted Tilly on her back. "She missed you." Jane turned to Japheth and called out, "Are you coming inside?" "After you," he replied. When they were all seated in the living room with Tilly on Jane's lap, Japheth said he was going to ask around to see if anyone knew of a lawyer, and mentioned Adam might know one. "How would Adam know of a lawyer, Japheth?" Wendy asked. "He's been living in this area long enough. He knows everyone. He'll know someone who knows a good lawyer, someone to do with family law," he said. Wendy nodded. "That's what we need, a family law specialist." Jane didn't need more worries. "I can't believe he's dead. It's like I'm in a bad dream. I mean, he was Tilly's father. Not that I wanted her to have anything to do with him. It doesn't seem real somehow." "It's a shock," Japheth said in a sympathetic tone. After she gave a huge sigh, Jane said, "I can't get a lawyer. I've got no money. I'll have to represent myself at court." Japheth shook his head. "That would be a dreadful idea." "I've got no choice. People can represent themselves, defend themselves, or whatever the correct terminology is." Frowning at her, Japheth said, "You're too fiery and hot-tempered. You'd lose your cool." Jane looked at him, knowing what he said was true. "Don't worry. I'll find a cheap lawyer," Japheth said. "Coffee, Japheth?" Wendy asked. "No, thank you." "He or she might not be any good if they're cheap," Jane said in response to his earlier comment. Wendy filled the kettle with water, while Japheth said, "Trust me, I'll find one. Perhaps they could set up some sort of payment plan." "You think so?" Jane asked. He nodded. "Leave it with me." "Thank you, Japheth. I don't know what I would have done if you weren't here." "Just relax and don't think the worst all the time." "It's pretty hard to stop fearful thoughts flashing through my mind." "Do your best," he said. Jane opened the door the next afternoon, knowing it was Japheth. "Did you find a lawyer?" She stepped back to let him inside. He took a giant step into the house. "I found someone who's supposed to be very good." "Supposed to be?" "He is very good. Trust me," he assured her. He kept telling her to trust him, but trusting people wasn't easy. Japheth had been good to her so far and had not given her one reason not to trust him. He seemed just as nice as his grandfather. "His name is Philip Primrose Peabody," he said. Giggles rang out from the kitchen. A smile slowly crept over Japheth's face. "It doesn't matter what his name is, Wendy." "I'm sorry," Wendy called out from the kitchen. Jane said, "I don't care what his name is as long as he can get the job done." "Exactly. We've got an appointment to see him tomorrow at 4:30. "We?" His lips tilted upward. "You're coming with me?" "If you want me to," he replied. "Yes, I'd like you to come with me. I'm glad we could get in to see him so soon." She put a hand to her heart. "I probably need 2 lawyers, one that does criminal law and one for family law." "Relax. You haven't been arrested for anything to do with Scott's murder. Don't go thinking too far ahead. I thought 4:30 would be a good time because that gives us enough time to get the delivery collected and get into town. And I can help you tomorrow. You'll just need to show me what to do," he said. "Can I get some help in here?" the voice from the kitchen asked. Jane spun around and headed to the kitchen with Japheth not far behind her. "What can I do?" Japheth asked. "Just watch what we do for now," Wendy said. He slouched against the wall with his arms across his chest. "I'm a fast learner," he said. "There'll be plenty for you to do tomorrow," Jane said. The next morning, Jane stood at the window, getting the milk ready for Tilly's morning drink. She'd just started several slices of bread toasting, too. When she looked up at Adam's house through the window, she saw Japheth strolling over to her house with a mug in his hand. "He's early," she said to Tilly, who was sitting in her high chair up at the table. "Don't move a muscle," she said to Tilly as she raced to open the front door. "Come in," she yelled to Japheth, and then she walked back to the kitchen. She immediately checked the bread under the grill. The last thing she needed was another accident with burned food. He walked into the kitchen. "Hello there?" "Hello?" "You didn't exactly tell me what time to come. I know you start early, so I wasn't sure," he said. She glanced over at him. "Have a seat." He sat down, reached forward and tickled Tilly under her chin, which made her laugh. "Do you want me to come back a little later?" he asked. "No, that's fine. I'll start just as soon as we finish breakfast. You can stay." She placed small strips of toast in front of Tilly, who preferred to feed herself with things she could hold in her hand. Even at this age, she was showing an independent streak. "I can't wait to get started," he said. Jane giggled. "I'm glad you're enthusiastic." "I am. I've never made cupcakes before. I'm just not sure what my friends would say about it," he said. "What? A man in the kitchen? You were telling me the other day that it wasn't so surprising. Adam has to cook for himself, and so does any man who's not married. Otherwise, they'd starve." "Not if they bought takeout," he said. Jane's eyebrows rose. "That could end up expensive." "True," he replied. "Thank you for helping me today. With you and Wendy around the house so much, I don't feel so alone," she told him. "I'm glad I'm being of some help to someone on my short stay here. I still haven't gotten to that roof leak yet. I've got that next on the list. Adam's kept me busy with a few things over there," he said. Jane nodded, wondering just how long that stay would be if he called it a short stay. He'd said his mother wanted him to look for a wife while he was there. But was that what he wanted? When they had finished their breakfast, Tilly was placed in the playpen while Jane proceeded to show Japheth how to cream the butter and the sugar with the gas-powered mixer. "Doesn't Tilly ever get bored in there by herself?" he asked. "She's not by herself, she can see us. And there are plenty of things in there to keep her occupied, and I play with her every chance I get between batches." He nodded. Did he think she wasn't being attentive enough to Tilly? Everything was a balance, a juggling act, the balance that every working mother had to strike. Something had to give, and sometimes it was everything that had to give a little, in order to get everything accomplished. There was no use explaining that to someone like Japheth, who had only ever had himself to worry about. Once they had the first batch in the oven, it was on to spooning the cake batter mixture into the next lot of trays. "Just as well you've got so many trays," he said. "It saves time. I'm all about saving time." She studied the careful concentration on his face as he spooned just the right amount of batter into each section. The silence was a welcome change, and she was glad he wasn't giving her a lecture about a larger oven, or telling her how to run her life. "I am saving up for a bigger oven," Jane mentioned out of the blue. "I know, you told me. Why didn't you just ask Adam to put in a big one for you?" he asked. Jane gasped. "I couldn't do that." "Why not?" he frowned. "I just couldn't. He's already been so good to me," she told him. "It wouldn't make any difference to him. He's got a lot of money, and I can tell he's really pleased how you're making a life for yourself and Tilly," he said. "But still, it's not my money. And I told you, he lets me stay here for practically nothing," she replied. "He could get you a larger oven, and then you could pay a little extra in rent. You wouldn't be paying it off because it wouldn't be yours. It would belong to the house, but you would have use of it. Adam could perhaps cover his costs with just a little more rent," he told her. "I knew you were thinking of something. You weren't concentrating on the cakes at all, were you?" she asked. He laughed. "You got me. It's a solution, but it's not a solution that I'm going to approach Adam about. I just couldn't." She picked up the wooden spoon and waved it at him. "And you're not going to mention it either." "I won't if you don't want me to," he said. "I don't." Once the first lot of cakes was out of the oven and the second lot was in, Tilly started to wail. "That signals her nap time. She has a sleep in the morning and one in the afternoon." "And you put her upstairs or in the crib in there?" He nodded toward the old dining room, which was now the playroom. "Either one." She climbed over the railing. "I'll change her diaper and give her a bottle, and she might go to sleep upstairs. Watch the cakes for me and take them out when the buzzer chimes?" "Sure. I'm glad to see you're using a timer now," he replied. She rolled her eyes and remained silent while she took Tilly out of the playroom. When Tilly was in her crib, Jane came downstairs. Japheth had the second lot out of the oven, and he already had another lot ready to go in. "I'm impressed," Jane said, looking at the work he'd done. "Thank you. That means a lot coming from you," he said. She giggled. "You can have a break now if you wish." "A lunch break?" he asked. "Yeah. Okay, I guess I better go and say hello to old Adam," he said. Chapter 18. As they sat in the back seat of the taxi, Japheth glanced over at her. "Nervous?" he asked. "Very nervous." She swallowed hard and struggled to breathe. "We must trust that everything will work out well," he told her. She rubbed her face with both hands. Life could have been worse. Money was coming in, she had a place to live, and there were some people in the community who supported her. Her situation could have been worse. When Jane and Japheth stepped out of the taxi, they saw from the names on the office window that Primrose Peabody worked with at least 4 other lawyers. Their office was in a prime position, being directly opposite the courthouse. Jane added up everything in her mind. Going by the name of Peabody Primrose, Morgan, Stanford, and McDonald, Peabody Primrose was a partner, and judging by the position of the office, none of this would come cheap. Just as well they'd offered a payment plan. Whatever it cost her was going to be worth it because there was no price on Tilly's future, and she had to keep her away from the Crittenden family. Scott had clearly lied to his family, and now they were out to ruin her life. Japheth reached high over Jane's head to push the door of the office open for her to walk through first. In front of her was a large marble-like reception area. Jane cleared her throat when the well-groomed secretary looked up. "We're here to see Mr. Primrose Peabody." She smiled and glanced at the computer screen beside her. "Jane Byler?" "Yes." "He won't be a moment. Would you like to take a seat?" She gestured to 2 couches off to the side. Jane's fingernails found their way to her mouth while they waited. "Don't be worried. This is just a preventative measure. They haven't even seen a lawyer as far as we know." "I know." Jane was deliberately keeping her mind occupied by counting the squares on the wallpaper when a small, balding man appeared in the hallway. "Jane Byler?" "Yes." "Come through." Jane stood up and then turned around to see Japheth was still seated. "Please come in with me. I mightn't remember everything he says." "Sure." Japheth bounded to his feet. A few steps further down the hall and they were in Primrose Peabody's office. He closed the door behind them. "Have a seat." There were 2 office chairs in front of a desk, and when Jane sat down, she looked around the office to see sporting memorabilia on the walls. Her attention was particularly taken with a boxing glove behind a gold frame. As soon as the lawyer was seated, he began, "From what I understand, you are a single parent, and someone who claims he is the father of your child has stepped forward and is threatening to take the child away from you." "That's right," she replied. The lawyer asked her the names of the individuals concerned, and after he'd jotted them down, he looked back up at her. "I know the Crittendens quite well," he said. Jane gasped. "They're not clients of yours, are they?" His thin lips curled upward. "If they were, I wouldn't be speaking with you. I know the law firm and the lawyers they use. We should be able to keep this out of the courts and get it resolved fairly quickly." He made some notes again and looked up at Jane. "Scott Crittenden is the father, you say?" he asked. "Yes, but only because he raped me." He blinked a couple of times. "Did he ever admit to that?" he asked. "No, he denied it." "Of course he would have." He put his pen down and leaned back in his chair. "I take it you never made a police report?" Jane shook her head. "No, I didn't. And I denied it to Scott when he asked me if the child was his. Still, he seemed convinced that she was." She replied. "I guess that changes things quite a bit, does it?" Japheth asked. "It could get messy. Are you willing to give the family any visitation?" he asked. "Absolutely not." Anger rose within Jane and she was calmed by Japheth softly placing his fingertips on her arm. "I don't want them anywhere near her. He was a violent and horrible person, and from what I've seen of his mother, she's just the same." "Just to be clear, you didn't file a report after the rape took place?" he asked again. "No." "And why is that?" the lawyer asked. He drugged me and I didn't think anyone would believe me. I can remember glimpses of it and I remember fading in and out of consciousness. I didn't have any bruises on me or any signs of violence because the drug made me unable to fight his assault, so I didn't think anyone would believe me. It would have been better if you'd filed a complaint or made some attempt to have him charged, but we can't do anything about that now, he said. I didn't know. And of course I didn't know I had become pregnant from the rape until later. He leaned forward and picked up his pen. What happens now? Japheth asked. I'll get in touch with their lawyers and see if we can resolve this thing quickly and keep it out of court, he said. Jane clasped her hands tightly in her lap. But what does that mean? There's no compromise here. I don't want them to see her at all. Their first step would likely be to prove paternity, which means they'd place an order to have your child DNA tested. That would be the first step. I'll make a call and see what their intentions are and how far they're willing to go with all this. Jane nodded. That would be good, thank you. His thin lips turned upward at the corners. Until then, Miss Byler, try not to worry, he said with a sympathetic smile. Japheth said, That's easier said than done. Jane's been through a lot already, and this is something she doesn't need. Jane blinked back tears. I thought he moved to New York, and I thought I'd never have to see him again. Japheth placed a hand on her shoulder. Is there any way I can contact you by phone? The lawyer asked with pen poised. Shaking her head, she said, No, I don't have a phone, but I could call you tomorrow afternoon. I have a phone where I'm staying. I can give you that number. I'm staying next door to Jane, he said. And your name? He asked. Japheth Fisher, he replied. And you're a relative of Jane's? He asked. A friend. Japheth gave him the number of the phone in his grandfather's barn. Very good. I'll call you as soon as I know anything and also send you a letter so you'll have everything in writing. I don't suppose either of you have email? They both shook their heads. And what about money? What do I owe you for today? Jane asked. We'll worry about all that later. It's something I can't tell you until I know where we stand with the Crittenden family. These kinds of cases can vary greatly. He stood up. Japheth stood as well. Thank you. Jane was the last to get to her feet. It felt awful being so helpless and not being able to do anything herself. Leaving it in someone else's hands was an odd feeling. Come on, Jane, Japheth whispered. When they were back outside, Jane took several deep breaths to calm herself. We're taking on the whole family, and they're wealthy and they have lawyers. He said he knows the lawyers they use. That means they must sue people all the time, and they've got more than one lawyer. Not necessarily. Sometimes people in business use lawyers for all kinds of things. He rested his hand gently on her shoulder. Let's go somewhere for a drink before we go home. I don't drink. Tea, coffee, ice cream? Let's just go somewhere before I take you home again, he said. She slowly nodded. I'd like that. Chapter 19. Japheth nodded his head toward a cafe up the road. That must be where people go before and after they go to court, he said. Let's go there then. She started walking and he followed. Once they were inside the small cafe, they squeezed into a booth and Japheth passed the menu over to her. My treat. I do have money, you know. You don't have to pay for everything, she said. That's what men do. Men look after women, he told her. She managed a smile as she picked up the menu. She hadn't had anyone look after her for a long time. Not only did he make her feel calm, he also made her feel protected. I think I'll have a chocolate shake. Is that all? He asked. She touched her stomach. I couldn't eat a thing. He shook his head. That's what you always say. Why don't you have a sandwich or something? I truly couldn't eat anything. Don't let me stop you having something, she said. No one could stop that. He ordered a serve of waffles and kept her company by also having a shake. Once the waitress left, he said, Don't feel threatened, like it's just you against the whole Crittenden family. You've got God on your side. God? Yeah, remember him? He asked. Jane managed to smile. I'm sorry, I thought you said something else. If we have God, nothing can come in our way. You've got him fighting your battles, so don't worry, he told her. I'm sorry, but sometimes I think horrible things. Like, where was God when I was attacked? Why didn't he stop it? She asked. Why didn't he? He replied. She nodded. You should know why every time you look into your little girl's face, he said. Jane exhaled a deep breath. That's true, I wouldn't have Tilly. But couldn't I have had Tilly after I was married so she could have had a father and proper family? And maybe my parents as proper grandparents? I know what you mean. I really don't have the answers, and I don't think anyone does. Sometimes we just have to take the good with the bad and stop trying to find reasons why the bad things happen. Was he punishing me? I don't believe so. It's part of being human and living on this earth. Bad things happen to good people sometimes, he said as he shrugged his shoulders. Many people believe God tests his children, but sometimes really horrible things happen and I don't think he has anything to do with it, he said. Jane sucked on her straw. I'll never know. Don't let what happened come between you and God, he told her. I did for a long time, wondering if he had allowed it to happen. I came back to the community after it happened, and I thought it might have been God's way of bringing me back. But if he's the Almighty, he could have done that in some other way. Who knows? I firmly believe he wants us to trust and keep trusting because he knows the end from the beginning, he replied. Jane rubbed her neck and then sudden tears flowed down her face. Japheth slid out from his seat and moved to sit next to her. He put his arm around her shoulders and held her tight. I wish I could make it all better for you and take away the horrible thing that happened. She continued to sob and he passed her a paper napkin and she wiped her eyes. I'm sorry. I'm a mess. That's understandable. Who wouldn't be? You've been through so much, but some of it might be coming to an end soon. I thought it was over when he died. I thought he'd be out of my life for good. When they stepped out of the taxi at Jane's house, Japheth said, Are you okay? She shook her head. When I get upset like this, I often get a migraine. Have you got one now? He asked. She put a hand to her head. I can feel one coming on. Do you take anything for them? He asked. Nothing works. Painkillers don't work, and I haven't found anything that does except a cold washcloth and just sleeping it off. I'll come with you to Wendy's to get Tilly. Maybe you should stay at my house tonight or at Wendy's, he asked. I'll be okay. What if you're so sick you can't look after Tilly? He asked. It'll be okay. I'll have Sally, Wendy's mother, check on me first thing in the morning. Will you? He asked. I will. I'll be all right. I've gotten used to living by myself. You go fix Adam some dinner. Are you sure? He asked. She nodded. I'm quite sure. I'll stop by to check on you tomorrow, he told her. Okay. Thank you for everything you've done, Japheth. I haven't done much at all, he said with a shrug. You have. You've been there to keep me calm and you found the lawyer. He seems to know what he's doing. I don't know what I would have done without you. It's nothing. Now go and fetch Tilly, he demanded. She gave him a big smile and then they each turned and went their separate ways. Jane knew the signs of the migraines that plagued her every few weeks. There was the feeling of not being in her body, the sparkles at the edges of her vision, and the nausea that would soon be swirling in her stomach. She knocked on the door of Wendy's home, and Wendy's mother, Sally, opened it. We were just talking about you. She stepped back to let Jane through the door. Were you? Wendy asked. We were just saying we thought you'd be coming home soon, Jane said. She looked over to the living room and saw Tilly asleep on the couch with Wendy sitting beside her. She's asleep? Tilly was upset and was asking for you, and she's only just fallen asleep. She was asking for me? Jane frowned. She was saying, Mama, Mama. Jane smiled. Jane, would you stay for dinner? We've got plenty. The thought of not having to cook dinner pleased Jane immensely. I'd like that, thank you. After Wendy had gotten up from the couch, she searched Jane's face. How did things go? Yeah, Wendy told me where you were. Did things go okay? Sally asked. I think everything went okay, but it's put me under so much stress that I fear I might be having another migraine coming on. Sally turned to Wendy. Wendy, would you stay at Jane's tonight? You want me to stay with you, Jane? Jane could only nod. These people had become like a family, and she didn't know what she would have done without them. Her migraines were debilitating, and it would have been so hard to look after Tilly with one of her full-blown migraines. Thank you, Wendy. And don't worry about the cupcakes. I can cook them myself tomorrow. Don't worry, Wendy said. I should be okay. I might not get a headache. I can do it all myself if you do. What about the piping? Jane asked. Wendy smiled. I've been practicing. Have you? Yeah, I figured out it's all in the wrist motion. I only had problems with finishing the piping, and now I've perfected that with a flick of my wrist. I suppose it is all in the wrist. I never really thought about it. Jane's gaze traveled to Tilly's small face as she lay asleep on the couch. She was a perfectly wonderful child, which was amazing considering who her father was. Chapter 20. Jane went to sleep that night with everything she would need for the impending migraine. On her nightstand were painkillers, even though she was certain they didn't do much good, a large glass of water, and a washcloth on a plate. She woke in the middle of the night with a migraine, and she summoned all her strength to sit up and take the painkillers. After she had swallowed the pills with a mouthful of water, she poured water on the washcloth and then lay back down, spreading the wet cloth on her forehead. There wasn't much of a chance she'd get any sleep that night. The best defense, she'd learned, was to let her body go and relax. Holding tension in her body only made things worse. She deliberately relaxed her shoulders, neck, and facial muscles, while visualizing lying beside a beautiful waterfall and crystal-clear flowing stream. The next time she came awake, sunlight was streaming into the room from the open curtains in her bedroom. Then she heard a whisper. Jane, how are you feeling? She looked around to see Wendy. Not good. I'm so glad you stayed over. Can I get you anything? Wendy asked. Ice. Can you put some in my washcloth? Yeah. She stepped forward and took it from her. How's Tilly? She's fine. We've had breakfast and she's gone back to sleep. I've got the first of the cakes in the oven. Don't worry about a thing. I can handle it all. You just close your eyes and I'll get ice inside the cloth and put it on your forehead. Having no strength to answer, Jane closed her eyes. Minutes later, she felt an icy cold, wet washcloth being applied to her forehead, and then she heard Wendy tiptoe away. When Jane opened her eyes some time later, she turned to see salty crackers on her nightstand. She sat up and managed to munch on one. Worried about Tilly and the cupcakes, she summoned some energy and pulled on her dressing gown in readiness to walk downstairs. When she heard a male voice coming from downstairs, she sat back down on her bed. Japheth was in the house. He said he'd come and help out if she was ill. She wasn't ready to see anyone looking like the fright that she was, but she had to check on things. If she lost Miranda's business, it would be hard to find someone else to buy so many cupcakes. She exchanged the dressing gown and her nightgown for a dress, and then leaned over and grabbed her prayer cap and placed it on her head, pushing her hair underneath. Then she made her way to the kitchen. Japheth was packaging the cupcakes when she walked into the kitchen. How are you feeling? He asked. Better. Jane, you look dreadful. You should go back to bed, he told her. Where's Tilly? She asked. She's just gone down for a nap, he replied. Thanks for helping, Japheth. It's been fun, he said. Jane managed a smile, figuring he wouldn't think that after he'd done 20,000 of them. The frosting on the cakes wasn't executed quite as well as she could do it, but it was a satisfactory effort. You've improved, Wendy, Jane said. I told you I've been practicing. She glanced up at Japheth, who was frowning at her. Thank you to both of you. I'm glad you're a little better, Japheth said. He and Wendy both looked back at Jane. Do you think you can eat something, Jane? Wendy asked. Maybe a little bit of something. I had those crackers. Could you make me a sandwich? Sure. Japheth put the last cupcake into the box. All done. He glanced at the clock on the wall. All done with 15 minutes to spare. That's wonderful. He sat down next to Jane. Have you been to the doctor about your headaches? I've been to more than one. I've tried a few different medications and nothing works for me. There's something preventative that I can take every day, but I don't like to do that. What do you want on your sandwich, Jane? Just whatever is there. Cheese will do. Would you like one too, Japheth? No, thank you. When they heard a car pull up, Japheth looked out the window. She's early. He gathered the boxes, carefully placing one on top of the other, and headed out the door. Chapter 21. Several days later. Japheth climbed down from the ladder and headed inside Jane's house. "That's the roof fixed," he said. "Really? You fixed it?" It was early evening and Jane was in the middle of peeling vegetables for dinner. "Just the roof. I still have to fix the ceiling and I'll need to get the proper equipment and materials for that. I'm going to that barn raising tomorrow and I'll find out from one of the men where's the best place to get the plasterboard for the ceiling," he told her. "Would that be expensive?" she asked. "It won't be much at all and you won't be paying for it," he replied. "But I've been living here and I've probably made it worse since I didn't tell Adam when it first happened." "Don't worry about it. It won't cost much, just a few cents." "Thank you. It's nice of you to repair it." "I'm only doing it because it's Adam's house." He smirked at her and she looked away. Jane knew he liked her. "I didn't know you were going to the barn raising tomorrow." He sat down at the table with her. "You're not going?" he asked. "How can I? Who would make the cupcakes? The cupcake fairy?" He raised his hands. "It was just a question. Don't get agitated." Even though he liked her, he would probably rather a woman who got involved more with things. The type of woman who would get involved with helping with the food for the barn raising. "I could have baked cupcakes for the workers. I should have done that." He laughed. "Cupcakes are too fancy for them. Don't worry about it." "Do you think so?" she asked. He nodded. "I won't leave the ceiling too long. I'll have it patched up in a few days. At least the rain will stay out now." He clapped his hands together. "Now, what other jobs do you have for me?" he asked. "Nothing," she replied. "I know there's something. I'm sure you mentioned the other day that there was something else that needed doing. There's a window upstairs in the spare room that doesn't close properly. The wind whistles through. I've put a towel there to keep out the cold," she said. "That's not good," he replied. "I know." "How big is the gap?" he asked. "Not much at all. It's only when it's really cold in wintertime that I feel it." "I'll have a quick look," he said. Jane placed her peeling knife on the counter. "I'll show you." He stood in front of the window and tried unsuccessfully to open it, and then he tried to close it. "It's stuck," he said. "I know. That's what I said." "I didn't realize that you meant it wouldn't go up either. It's not as if I didn't believe you," he told her. "Good." He looked around and saw a chair, and then pulled it over to the window. He stood on the chair, and then he put all his weight behind the window frame and forced it closed. "There, that solves that problem for now. I'm no expert on windows. I'm sure there'll be someone at the barn raising who can tell me how to fix it properly." He got down from the chair and put it back where it had been. Looking at Jane, he asked, "What else?" "Nothing. There's nothing else. Not that I can think of at the moment." "Okay, then I should get back to old Adam," he said. The next day when Miranda had been and gone, Jane was left alone to think about Japheth. He seemed too good to be true. Maybe there was something about him she didn't know. Something that was not so good if his mother had wanted him to come to this community to find a wife. She'd been meaning to talk to Adam, hoping to find out whether Japheth had mentioned anything about a new and bigger oven. That would be embarrassing, and she hoped that Japheth had left that subject well and truly alone. "Tilly, we're going to visit Adam." She picked Tilly up out of the high chair and headed to Adam's house. She'd get him talking, and hopefully find out a few things. She knocked on Adam's door, hoping he would be awake. Since he opened the door pretty quickly, she didn't think he'd been asleep. His large frame filled the doorway as he stared at them both. What a delightful surprise. "Are you here to see me or Japheth? Because he's not here." Jane gave an embarrassed giggle. "We're here to see you. You haven't been to the house lately and we thought we'd pay you a visit." "Good. Come inside." He led her through to the kitchen and turned around. "I should take you to the living room, not the kitchen." "Here's fine." "Yeah?" She nodded and sat down with Tilly on her lap. When Adam sat, he made funny faces at Tilly to make her laugh. She giggled like Jane had never heard her laugh before. Adam chuckled. "It works better when she hasn't seen me for a while." "It seems so. Where's Japheth?" "He's at the barn raising, didn't he tell you?" he asked. "He might have." "You've been seeing a bit of him," he observed. He's been such a huge help to me. I don't know if he told you anything that's been going on?" she asked. "He did. He said Tilly's father. Well, he told me about what happened with him being murdered. I'm very sorry to hear that." He shook his head. "Japheth has been very supportive to me. He's a really nice man." This was Adam's opportunity to say something if he knew something to the contrary. "Wouldn't you expect that from my grandchild?" Adam chuckled. Jane smiled and nodded, wondering how else she could find out more about Japheth without asking outright. "Did you have much to do with him when he was growing up?" "Yeah, a fair amount. They lived here before they moved away," he said. "So he's as nice as he seems?" It was hardly subtle, but she couldn't think of any other way to ask the question since Adam wasn't coming forward with any information of his own. He stared at Jane. "He is. How about a cup of hot tea?" he offered. "Thank you, Adam. Would you like to hold Tilly while I make it?" He chuckled. "Okay." Jane stood up and passed Tilly over. Adam bounced her up and down on his knee and Tilly squealed with delight. Jane passed the next hour or so chatting with Adam and was satisfied that there was nothing dark about Japheth. Or if there was, Adam knew nothing. It was early the next day when she saw Japheth again. He was walking purposefully to the house and she hoped he wasn't upset she'd been talking about him to Adam. With Tilly on one hip, she opened the front door with her free hand. "I got a call from Primrose Peabody. He's coming here just after 4. He wanted to tell you something in person," he told her. "Ach no, I hope it's not bad news." He didn't say. It was actually his secretary who called. "I can't be here because I told someone I'd meet him at the hardware store to buy the plasterboard for the ceiling repair. He's showing me exactly what to get, unless I get in touch with him and change the time," he said. "No, you go as planned. Don't change the time. I'll be able to handle it no matter whether it's good news or bad." "It's probably good news," he said. "I hope so. Thank you for letting me know. Do you want to come in?" "No, I was in the middle of cooking breakfast for Adam when the call came. I'll go back and finish it." Japheth pulled a face. "Then he wants to talk with me," he said. Jane hoped Adam wouldn't say she'd been over there asking questions about him. "Okay. I'll let you know what it's about when you get home this evening. I'll come here as soon as I get back." Jane nodded. Throughout the day, Jane did her best to concentrate on the cupcakes, but all she could do was worry about what the lawyer might have to say. When a car pulled up outside her house just as Miranda drove away with the order, she ran to the door and opened it. Mr. Primrose Peabody was getting out of his car. She studied his face and couldn't tell whether he had good news or bad. "What is it?" she asked as she ran to him. "How about we go inside and I'll tell you when we're sitting down," he said. "Yes, of course, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting my manners." She showed him into the living room, and when they were seated, he said, "I've got something to tell you that you'll be pleased about." "What is it?" "The Crittendens are not proceeding with the custody case," he told her. A load lifted off her shoulders and she exhaled heavily. "Can they still try something else?" she asked. "I don't think they'd be likely to do anything. I heard that a friend of Scott Crittenden came forward and told the Crittendens exactly what happened regarding you. He produced a text that showed Scott boasting about what he did to you. And after that, Scott and his friend parted ways, but his friend kept the text. When he heard of Scott's death and the rumors that his parents were trying to take your baby, he came forward." "I'm so pleased. That must have been Bonnie." She hadn't seen Bonnie since the incident. He could have been the one who'd had the falling out with Scott. "I don't think they'll be bothering you again. It'll be up to you whether your child has a relationship with them," he said. "No, definitely not. They're not nice people." "That's up to you," he replied. "Thank you for coming all this way to tell me." "It's not that far. It was on my way home and you don't have a phone. I wanted to tell you in person," he said as he looked around him. She pushed herself back into the couch. "I can't believe it's all over. Well, mostly over. Do you know if they found out who killed him yet?" she asked. "I haven't heard." He rose to his feet. "I'll leave you to it." Jumping to her feet with renewed energy, she inquired, "How much do I owe you for everything?" "That's all been taken care of," he said. "What do you mean?" "Someone has stepped forward on your behalf to take care of the financial side of things." She put a hand to her throat and tried to figure out who it would be. "The Crittendens?" He chuckled. No. She knew it wasn't her parents, and the only person she could think of was her new friend. Japheth Fisher? I believe the person didn't want to be named. He gave a slight raise of his eyebrows before he walked toward the door. Managing to get there first, she opened the door for him. Standing in a daze, she watched the lawyer walk down the porch steps and get into his car. When he drove away, she marched over to Adam's house and knocked on the door, hoping Japheth was home. Japheth opened the door and she told him the good news. Scott's family is dropping things. They found out the truth from a former friend of Scott's, and I don't have to worry about anything anymore. That wasn't quite true. She knew she wasn't in the clear over Scott's murder. He stepped outside with her. That's wonderful. Japheth, did you pay the lawyer? She asked. His lips twitched. I had some savings. Don't make a big deal out of it, he said. She threw her arms around his neck and kissed him on his cheek. He pulled her arms away and placed them down by her sides. Adam might see, he said. Well, tell him how truly wonderful you are. He already knows that, he replied. Jane giggled. I'll pay you back every cent. No, you will not. Let's not get into an argument about that because I'll win. I'm really happy for you that everything turned out well, Jane, he said. He seemed strangely distant. You don't seem very happy. Adam says he's okay and I should go home back to my job. He's politely kicking me out, he said. Jane stepped back. You're leaving? He nodded. Yeah, I'm not sure when. You'll be at the meeting on Sunday, won't you? What's today? He asked. Friday, and the meeting's on this Sunday. Yeah, I will. I'll let you know way ahead of time before I go. We'll have to celebrate me leaving. Jane pouted. It's not a celebration. Where's Tilly? He asked. She's fast asleep. She glanced back at her house. I better get back home. I'll stop by tomorrow and fix that ceiling if that's okay, he said. Of course. I'll be there all day. I'm not going anywhere. They still don't know who killed Scott. Don't worry. I'm sure if they thought it was you, they would have arrested you by now. I know, but it's hanging over my head because of the letter and everything. Can't you stay until that's sorted? She asked. He looked down at the ground. Some murder cases are never solved. When he looked back at her, he said, Cheer up. It's not as though I'm leaving tomorrow. Chapter 22. Japheth had fixed her ceiling and hadn't wanted to stay for coffee or to just hang around like he usually did. Jane figured it was because he was going home in a few days. What was the point of getting too close to each other if he was leaving so soon? With Tilly asleep, Jane was settling down with a cup of tea when a knock sounded on her door. She glanced at the clock as though that would tell her who it might be. It was 5 o'clock. Miranda had already picked up her order and it wouldn't be her back again. She didn't know anyone who knocked that loud. She opened the door to see Officer Davies. Her heart lurched as she hoped he wasn't there to arrest her. Yes? I've got an update on Scott Crittenden's murder. She clutched her throat. Yes? We've made an arrest, he told her. You have? She asked. He nodded, and for the first time she saw a hint of a smile on his severe face. After we arrested him, he confessed everything. Who was it? One of his brothers, he replied. Really? His own brother? Why did he do it? She asked. They'd always had a heated relationship. Scott Crittenden allegedly raped his sister-in-law some years ago, and when she told her husband, he went right over to his brother's apartment and the altercation took place. He told her. That's horrible. I wasn't the only one he did it to then. It appears so, he said. I'm totally in the clear? She asked him. Yes, as I said. We have a confession that supports the evidence we collected at the scene. She held her head and tears ran down her face. Her worries were over. That explains why the family's not trying to take custody of Tilly. He looked at her sympathetically. Will you be okay? Do you want us to call anyone? He asked. No, thank you. We'll be fine. When they left, she sat down on the couch and cried with relief. Before all this had happened, she felt sorry for herself every day and thought her life was dreadful. All this had shown her just how bad things could have gotten. Jane wanted to run over to Japheth and tell him she was in the clear. But considering his strange demeanor earlier, she stayed away. She'd tell him when she saw him at the meeting the very next day. Wanting to tell Japheth her news, Jane got a ride to the meeting with Adam and Japheth instead of asking Wendy's family. "See? I told you it would all work out in the end," he said. Jane nodded. "You did keep saying that." When they got to the house where the meeting was being held, Jane saw her mother outside the house. Japheth stood beside her while Adam secured the buggy. "Now's your chance to talk," he told her. "I'll try." Jane nodded, left Japheth, and with Tilly in her arms walked over to her mother. When she drew close, they made eye contact. "Hello, Mom." "Hello, Jane. All's good, I'm in the clear, they're not going to take Tilly away from me," she told her mother. "That's good." As usual, her mother avoided looking directly into her face. "Mom, how come you never look at me anymore?" Jane asked. Her mother glanced at her and looked away. "We said all we had to say a long time ago." "Why have you deserted me? I'm still your daughter," she said. Her father walked over. "What are you upsetting your mother about, Jane?" he asked. "I came to tell her the good news. Those people aren't going to try to take Tilly away from me now," she said. "Good. You can raise her yourself just how you always wanted, but you must leave your mother and me out of it," he told her. "She's your grandchild, don't you care about that?" Jane asked. Her father rubbed his dark beard. "You made your choices a long time ago, Jane," he told her. "I didn't choose this. I didn't choose any of this." Her parents looked around about them when she raised her voice. That's all they cared about, what other people thought about them. They walked away, leaving her standing there, holding on to Tilly. They had no love for her, and they had no love for their granddaughter. At that moment, Jane knew they would never change. Tears rolled down her face, and she knew she couldn't go to the meeting and face everyone. One part of her life was under control, but she'd always be looked down upon for something that had been out of her control. She shook her head. Where was the forgiveness? The bishop and his family had been good to her at least, and they couldn't help the attitudes of the rest of them. If she told the bishop how she felt about her treatment, he might say something and make matters worse. It was best to let things be. Since she'd come there with Adam and Japheth, she had to tell them she was leaving. She made her way to the door of the house and got Japheth's attention. He walked over to her. "The talk with your mother didn't do any good?" he asked. "No, I just had a bad and horrible conversation with both my parents. I can't stay here. I'm about to cry and then I won't be able to stop. I just wanted to tell you that Tilly and I are going home." "How?" he asked. "We're walking, it's not that far," she replied. "All the same, you can't walk home carrying Tilly all that way. She's far too heavy for that. I'll take you home and then come back," he said. "You can't." "I can. I'll tell Adam where I'm going. No one will miss me," he told her. Japheth was wrong. All the girls would miss him, but he didn't seem to know that. "Thank you, Japheth. Go and wait in the buggy," he told her. She turned around and headed to the buggy while he went back into the house. Good friends like Japheth and his grandfather and Wendy's family were even more precious when everyone else gave her the cold shoulder. They were her idea of what real Christians should be. Just when she and Tilly had gotten comfortable in the buggy, Japheth jumped into the driver's seat. "The bishop was probably going to announce that you're leaving soon, and he'll look around and you won't be anywhere," Jane said. "You can't do much about that. Anyway, it's embarrassing when that happens. I don't like everyone looking at me," he replied. "I know, it's embarrassing, isn't it? Their way of being friendly, I guess." He glanced over at her and she nodded. "Looks like Tilly's going to sleep," he said. "She always goes to sleep in the buggy. It's the clip-clopping or the rocking," she replied. "It used to put me to sleep when I was a kid, too." When they got to the house, he said, "Do you want me to stay with you? I don't like leaving you alone when you're upset." "You can't. That would look dreadful. You'd miss the meeting and then they'd find out you were here at my place." She shook her head. "Not good for your reputation." "Or yours," he replied. She shrugged and felt like saying it wouldn't change hers, but she didn't want to sound too depressing all the time. "Thank you for bringing us home. I really appreciate it. Maybe I can return all these favors one day. Just bake me a cupcake or 12 since the batch always has to be divisible by 12, he said. She laughed. You actually listen to what I say. I do, he replied. Thank you again. She wished he could stay with her all day, or at least for a few hours. When she and Tilly were clear of the buggy, he gave her a big smile before he moved his horse forward. She watched from the porch as the buggy headed back down the driveway to meet the road. And there he goes, Tilly. Tilly rested her head on her mother's shoulder. The young women won't leave him alone. He'll find a wife as easy as anything. He'd have a girlfriend by the end of the week if he weren't going home. Tilly yawned. Am I bothering you? Tilly stuck her thumb in her mouth and closed her eyes. I must be really boring. The only thing Jane was thinking about was all the girls who'd flock around Japheth, especially when they learned he was leaving soon. This would be their last chance with him. Chapter 23. The next morning, Jane opened her front door to Japheth. Jane, I've come to tell you I'm leaving on Tuesday, he said. She stared at him. It served her right for wondering if something might come of their relationship. Being married to her was most likely the last thing on his mind. Aren't you going to say something? He asked. When are you going? This Tuesday, tomorrow, you mean? She asked. He nodded. Tomorrow. So soon? I've been thinking about you, he told her. You have? He nodded. I think you should move away from here. It would be better for you to have a fresh start somewhere, don't you think? She had hoped he'd been thinking about her for a very different reason. I've often thought about it. It would be nice to be around people who didn't know me. And like you said, it would be a fresh start. What about my business, though? You'll find another Miranda, or set up on your own somewhere, he told her. Where would I go? Move to Harts County where I am. I'll find you a place to live and help you set yourself up, he suggested. He wanted her to move to his community. That thought pleased her. Thank you, but things are okay here. He breathed out heavily. Why don't you take a chance? On what? It'd be silly to move when I've got a place to live here and steady money coming in. I'll miss you, he told her. She didn't know what to say, but she couldn't stop smiling. Stay longer then. Adams told me he's fine on his own, he said. That's right. He's kicking you out. Japheth nodded, and the dimples appeared in his cheeks. She wanted to throw her arms around him and beg him to stay. I'll say a quick goodbye tomorrow morning before I go, he said. That's it? She was disappointed. Where was the celebration he'd talked about? Okay. He turned and walked away. What time are you leaving? She called out. 8 a.m, he yelled over his shoulder. She hoped he liked her, but surely he would have asked her out or taken her and Tilly out somewhere, on a date or something. In bed that night, Jane tossed and turned, wanting Japheth to change his mind and stay. At 8 the next morning, Jane was ready and waiting to say goodbye. She saw him from the kitchen window in his hat and black coat, making his way to her door. After she'd straightened her prayer cap and smoothed down her dress, she opened the door to his smiling face. You're really going? She asked sadly. Were you hoping I'd change my mind? He said. Yeah, I was. Do you remember the reason you told me you were here? It wasn't to watch over Adam. You mean my mother wanting me to find a wife? He asked. That's right, and you haven't done that yet. She'll be disappointed. He held up his hand. Ah, I said that's what she wanted. And you want something different? She asked. He looked down at the ground and then looked back up at her. The thing is, I don't want to marry just anyone. I have to be certain, he told her. Of course. She remembered him saying people had said that he was fussy. And I'm not sure what love feels like, to be honest with you, he said. There it was. He couldn't have said it any plainer. I hope you find whatever it is you want. Goodbye, Jane. He looked over her shoulder. Where's Tilly? He asked. Still asleep. Say goodbye to her for me? I will. They both looked over when they heard the taxi heading to the house. Here's my ride. Look after yourself, Jane. It was good to meet you. I won't say all right because I'm not into all that. he said. Jane nodded. I might see you again one day. You never know. He walked 2 steps away, stopped, and then turned back around. Why were you asking me all that just now? He asked. All what? About the reason I came here, he said. She couldn't tell him she liked him because he'd as good as told her he didn't feel the same. Jane just shrugged. He walked closer. Why did you ask, Jane? I just want you to... Everyone deserves love, to find that special person who will love them and only them. Is that what you want? He asked. His question caught her off guard. Yeah, I'd like that. I hope you find what you're looking for too, Jane, he told her. What about you? He tipped back his hat just slightly. I'm not sure that love, as you describe it, is real. Love is a decision. It could be that you make a decision about a person and then stick with it, he said. She wanted to ask him if that were the case. Why had he come there to find a wife? And why hadn't he found one by now in his community? It was as though he wanted to believe love between a man and a woman could be real and special. The taxi beeped and Japheth turned around and walked away, leaving Jane to wonder when and if she'd ever see him again. He collected his suitcase by Adam's porch, got into the taxi, and before she knew it, the taxi was heading away. When the taxi was out of sight, she closed the door. Japheth had made her believe in love again. Maybe one day their paths would cross, or maybe God had brought him into her life to give her hope. Until she saw him again, she'd do her best to put him out of her mind. It was 5 days later when Jane opened her front door to take cupcakes to Adam when she nearly ran smack bang into someone standing at the door. He had his hand up just about to knock. He stood there, smiling down at her, and then he nodded toward what he held in his hands. It was a white cake box. Another peace offering, he said. She laughed. What are you doing here? Can I come in? He asked. Yeah. She stepped back inside and placed the plate of cupcakes on a nearby table. What are you doing back here? I couldn't stop thinking about you. Her whole body tingled. Really? He nodded. Every time I look at a cake, which seemed to be every few minutes. She giggled at him. Oh, you got hungry, so you came back. No, Jane. He stepped forward, still holding his white box, and looked down into her eyes. I came back to convince you to marry me. Jane burst out laughing and then looked at his face to see that he was totally serious. You want to marry me? His dimples made an appearance. Only to help you out, that's all, he said. She looked into his blue eyes. Japheth, I think you're in love with me. I told you I don't believe in that kind of stuff, he replied. It's kind of you to offer to help me out, but I can't marry a person unless that person is in love with me. She went to walk around him, but he balanced the box in one hand and took hold of her hand with the other. What's love? It's just a word, he said. After she had glanced down at their hands touching, she looked up into his face. Love is everything. Love is commitment, understanding, trust, giving of oneself. Stop it. You're making me sick to my stomach. All right, I'm in love with you, Jane. Satisfied? He asked. She wrapped her arms around him and hugged him as tight as she could, and the box squashed between them. Slowly he placed his arms around her waist, and while she buried her face in his chest, he encircled her with his arms. I love you too, she said softly. Be quiet. I'm figuring out where we'll live and all that, he said. She stepped away and the squashed cake box fell on the floor. They both ignored it. If we're going to be married, you'll have to stop telling me to be quiet, Jane said. It's simply unacceptable. You started the whole be quiet business way back when we first met, he said. She giggled. Then I'll be the one to finish it. No more telling each other to be quiet, okay? He nodded. Done. With his foot, he moved the squashed cake and box out of the way, pulled her back into his arms, and rested his head gently on the top of hers. I do love you, Jane, whatever your last name is. You never told me your last name, do you know that? You never even told me your first name. I had to hear it from someone else. They both laughed. I'll be a good father to Tilly, he told her. I know you will. She closed her eyes and wanted to stay in his arms like that forever. God had sent her the only man in the world who understood her, and for that she would always be thankful. "Will you come back to Harts County with me? We'll make our home there," he asked. "I'd like that very much. In Harts County, no one would know about my past, and I'll blend in and be the same as everyone else." "Tell me you'll never be like everyone else. I like you just the way you are," he said. She pulled back and looked into his eyes. "And how's that?" "Short-tempered, a little annoying, bossy." "Okay, that'll do," she said with a smile. "Is that a new version of telling me to be quiet?" he asked. "I'd never say that because you'd never be quiet. If you don't stop talking, I'll have to kiss you," he teased. She smiled and said, "Right here, right now." He lowered his lips onto hers and kissed her gently. Jane and Japheth were married in Harts County 3 months later. Adam attended their wedding along with Wendy and her family. Jane's family didn't come to her wedding, but Jane still hoped that things between them might somehow mend one day. No longer did Jane keep up her frantic pace of making a living because Japheth worked hard and made enough to support the 3 of them. That didn't stop Jane from opening a small cupcake and coffee shop at the farmer's market, even though they soon had another little girl, and then a 3rd one. Now that Jane had the life she'd always wanted, she had the strength to help others, as the handful of people had been there to help her. Wendy accepted Jane's offer of employment, and her decision to make the move to Harts County was helped along by a handsome cousin of Japheth's. When Adam grew frail in his advancing years, Jane and Japheth's convinced him to live in the gross daddy house that they'd built onto their house for him. That way he'd be close, but still be independent. Jane was grateful to God for sending her a husband even though she had never thought to ask. If she had, she would have asked for one who made her laugh, a man exactly like Japheth. You have been listening to The Amish Single Mother, written by Samantha Price, narrated by Susanna Coleman. Copyright 2017 by Samantha Price. Production copyright 2023 by Samantha Price.